Okay, so just a few little disclaimers and reminders before we get started, that this is not a private conversation, but ultimately will be made available to the public. We endeavor for this to be as fun of an experience for you as possible, so if at any point we're into a topic that you don't want to discuss, just let me know and we'll redirect to another topic. And as Catherine said, if you need to take a break at any time, just let me know. We can easily do that. My role in our conversation is I strive to talk as little as possible. This is your story and we want to hear from you, not so much from me. But my lack of talking certainly shouldn't be an indication that I'm not paying attention. And I may, like you, be looking down at my notes occasionally. Yeah, so that's that. So we can actually begin. Today is Thursday, March 14th, 2019. My name is Andy Reisinger, and I am interviewing Lorraine Fontana here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University as part of the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. And before beginning, if I can just get your verbal confirmation and consent that you're aware and do consent to this being recorded.
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Also, a note to our listeners or viewers that you have been interviewed previously, including by Georgia State's Department of Special Collections and Archives as part of the Gender and Sexuality Oral History Project. So there's a two-part interview that already exists that covers a lot of ground, your life history and much of your work and activism. So this is a supplement to that. And I just want to let people know that in watching or listening to this, they should also go check out the other interviews because there's great information there as well. So in the prior interview, you did narrate your life story, but I did want to go back and sort of just to get a rhythm going and also to cover some ground. If you would describe when and where you were born.
I was born in New York City, 1947. So I'm a baby boom, beginning of the baby boom person.
And what date?
April 13.
Okay. And tell me a little bit about your family's background, how long they had been in New York City.
Both my parents had lived in New York City their whole life. They were among large families, some of whom their siblings were born in Italy before my grandparents on both sides had come over here. My parents are both younger people in their family, so they were born here. So we're Italian. I have one brother. We didn't have a large family. I didn't. But my parents, I have lots of aunts and uncles and lots of cousins. So 11 kids on one side and 7 kids on the other, and their family. So, but yeah, they were both born in New York, and I think early on my mother might have lived in Brooklyn first, then they got to Queens, and that's where I grew up, in Queens, in New York City.
And what are your parents' names?
Anne Fontana, or Anna was originally, and Ivo Fontana, and he was always called Eddie by everybody, but Ivo is his name. What?
And what about your grandparents on both sides, their names?
My mother's mother, Josephine Visali, or Noni, as all the grandkids called her. And my father's mother, oh my God, now I have to pull up her name. Laura. Trying to think of her maiden name. And I'm not pulling that up. But Fontana was her married name, of course. And they were both, my mother's family was from Sicily, and my father's family was from north central Italy.
Okay. And then, your paternal and maternal
Grandfathers, I
grandfather?
did not know either one. They died before I was born, both.
Mhm. Do you know what it was that, what the impetus was for them to come to the US?
Unfortunately, I don't know the story of my mother's family. Why? I'm not sure what the impetus was. I know that my mother's father was a jewelry maker, a jeweler. So he had a trade, and that's what he did when he came here. My father's family, I know a little bit more about. It took many years for the whole family to get over here. You couldn't just bring a bunch of all those kids over at one time. I guess, the immigration system, whatever happened. And there's also political disagreements about whether being there or not being there or coming here. And my understanding is, interestingly enough, my grandfather over there, he grew fruit and vegetables, and he would sell that in the city. They did in Modena. And that's what I understand he did when they were in Italy. And that's also what he did when he got over here. It was my grandmother who actually came over first and stayed because she worked in a factory back in Italy, and she knew how to make cigars, a cigar factory. And I guess someone had opened up, I think it was called the Napoli Cigar Factory, and it's opened up here, and they knew her from Italy and knew she was she knew how to do it, she could train people. So they asked her to come over and actually work here and do that. So she was the one that really wanted to stay and come over and stay, and my grandfather, I understand, was more like, and he would sometimes bring kids over and back. Supposedly he made like 12 or 13 trips back and forth from Italy here. My father actually went back with him one time when he was little and spent a couple of years in Italy going to school there. So, but that's about as much as I know, And so eventually, then they all, and even for a while, there were some kids that were left behind because they couldn't take everybody. I have an aunt who tells me the story because this is the aunt that I knew pretty well. She lived in Atlanta for a little while. She was one of the girls left behind. There were like 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl. And other family was supposed to take them in.
Mm-hmm.
And they did, the 2 boys, but they didn't want her. And so it ended up being like in a nunnery, where the nuns would take kids in. And what it was, from what I understand, is it was a way, well, first of all, if there were orphans and stuff like that, there might have been kids who were taken in. But in this case, it was like they were paid to keep her, and it was like a slavery thing she felt. It was like a horrible experience.
Mm-hmm.
Kids had to work and do certain things and treated real badly, and so she still remembers that, and that she was left and her family wouldn't take her in. It seemed to have something to do with gender. It seemed to have to do with a sexist kind of analysis of these boys we can use, and because they'll work and we'll put them to work, but her, she's just going to be an extra burden on us. That seemed to be the feeling. So anyway, but that's interesting because that's the only, for my father when he was there for a little while, and for my aunt, the only people that I knew that I could talk to about like what Italy was like.
Mm.
Never did get much from my grandmother. Interesting, because I remember now, my father's mother, even when I was little, she was very sickly, and then she ended up in the hospital for a long time. She had lots of stuff. She had diabetes, which I guess was not being treated that well back then, and she became blind, and she just ended up dying in the hospital from all these things. And so that's the grandmother I knew. I didn't know very much, and she never spoke English. So even when she was out of the hospital, it wasn't like we had real conversations. My mother's mother, on the other hand, I think now, I wish I'd been more interested. When I was a kid, I why would I be asking her about Italy and all? But I wish now, because I moved away before she was gone, but then she died, and I wasn't able to really have any conversations with her about tell me, because she did learn English after her husband died. He didn't want her to learn English. I found this later. It's like all these people about how, learn English, don't speak like Spanish now. These families, they didn't want to speak English, they wanted to speak Italian.
Mm.
And so she was told she shouldn't learn and speak English to the kids or anything. They have to learn in school, obviously, but after he died, she went to school at night to learn English. So she spoke like a broken English. I mean, you know, we could converse and everything, but it was clearly her second language. You know. But I never, you know, I'm thinking now, I would have had time, because we lived in the same building. She lived downstairs, we lived upstairs in this apartment building. So that's the grandma I knew,
Yeah.
basically.
And I guess the community that you were living in Queens was had a large enough Italian community that people could function easily only speaking Italian.
Oh, yeah. Like most places in New York City, people will gravitate to where their country people have set up, and to little neighborhoods of form. And our neighborhood actually was more Catholic than it was just Italian. There's a lot of Catholic folks. There were, in Astoria, there's still, and there were a lot of Greek Orthodox folks also, but a lot of Catholics, Italian, Irish, Polish, all kinds of, and still pretty Catholic, I think, but now much more Hispanic and
Mhm.
Latino.
And do you know how it is that your parents met?
What I was told is they met at the, you know, Italian-American Society. I mean, it was a neighborhood organization, and they had like dances, and they had a hall where people met and had events. So that's supposedly where they met.
And when did they get married, do you know?
I probably have to look it up. My brother is 4 years younger than me. I was born in 47. That's 43, 40. You know, I'd have to guess. I'd have to guess. Very early 40s, late 39s. My mother was born in 1919. My father was born in 1915. Yeah, I'd have to guess. I should know it, but I don't. I don't have it. I don't pull it up in my head.
And did
But
you,
it was, you know, he was. My brother was born before my father went to World War II. Then he was in World War II, and I was born, of course, after
Mhm.
he got back. And,
I was just gonna ask if
yeah.
he was called to service. And what type of work did your parents do?
My mother had learned typing in school, so she was a typist. What would be called now secretarial work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what she did the whole time she was working. And she and my father both worked most of the time when I was growing up. Trying to think of the year she retired, because she retired early because she was going blind, basically. She was legally blind. They always had her side of the family, and I had some of it. Has very bad eye stuff going on. So that's what happened with her. And my father had, and I only knew the degree to the different jobs he had when I found this, after he was passed, I found this sheet that he had written out. It's like we do resumes now, but he had just handwritten like the jobs he had had. So he did all kinds of work, everything from factory work to, you know, driving truck deliveries. He was a cabbie at one time. The ones that I know he did, he worked in the post office, letter carrier, and then he worked for the Transit Authority in New York. So that was a union job too, and that's what he stayed with. And over the years, it changed what he did. When he first started working there, he helped clean the subways at night. He was on a cleaning crew. And by the time he left, he was kind of in a supervisory, management type position, which he didn't like actually at all. In fact, I remember him, and most of the time though, what I remember is him he's the token guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's all changed now, but you'd have to go and buy your tokens, every time you went in. And that's what he did. So a lot of the times he changed his schedule, I guess, for while we were growing up. I think now it's about us, about kids wanting to be there. My mother working during the day, so he'd work at night. Subways are all open at night in New York, so yeah, he'd come home early in the day and sleep, and in the daytime. And that's usually why he was the one preparing dinner most of the times, because my mother was at work, and then she'd come home, and so he was a cook more than my mother was.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how people structure a family and time, and to have parents on opposite schedules.
Yeah.
How that is beneficial for child care and maintenance of the household,
Yeah.
but in terms of spending time together,
Yeah, it was, so
a real challenge.
It was the evening meal when mostly we could spend time together.
And so you went to school in Queens.
That's right. I went to, we moved a couple of times, and I went to elementary school one place. I finished elementary school in the second place we moved to, and then junior high was in another area. And I didn't go to high school in my neighborhood. I would have gone to, Oakdale High School, but I went to a magnet school, so then I went to another place in Queens, to go to that, kind of taking a couple of buses and a train, a couple of trains and a bus, and, it was a trip.
Mm-hmm.
To get to the high school I went to. And then I went to Queens College, so so because of that, I actually stayed living at home and during college too, and I was just going to Queens, during the day. I always think, boy, what would have changed? How would it have been real different because I gotten a Regents scholarship. I found that kind of late that I got it, because I was on like the waiting list.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they found out how many people weren't using whatever, but by then I had already decided I was going to Queens, and so I could have just said, oh, I want to, but somehow, trying to remember, it was me that I never would have wanted to go away, or my parents just said, no, it's too late to do all, because I hadn't applied to places. So I ended up going to Queens, which was great. I mean, I liked it. I think it was good. But would it have changed my whole trajectory? Being apart from my parents probably would have.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in your younger years, elementary, junior high, and on into high school, what were some of your interests and aspirations? What excited you?
Well, outside of school, it was simply being a tomboy. That's what people called it. I mean, I was really into games and sports, and doing stuff outside. I mean, it's interesting to think now how parents often seem very worried and guarded about their kids and where they go, and they go out and play, or should they, and it just wasn't like that back then. First of all, in elementary school, I could just walk to school. It was close. So you walk to school, and then you walk to the church, which is the other direction, and those are the two places you went to, other than playing on your block and in your neighborhood. And So I like doing all that kind of stuff. I also loved art. I always liked drawing, so that's why I went to the high school I did, become an art major in high school. It's a specialized kind of thing. So yeah, I did that. Trying to remember what other, oh, reading. I was like, I hear this a lot from friends of mine too. It was like, reading was important, just reading everything, you know. And that's what got me interested probably in the stuff that I ended up doing, you know, going to, in college and stuff. My brother got a scholarship. He went to a special high school in Brooklyn, as a matter of fact. He's a smart kid, Brooklyn Tech, and he got a scholarship, but didn't go to college. And you know, I often think, you know, I asked him once or twice, but there wasn't much of a response about why the hell did he not? It would have changed his life a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
None of his friends, I don't think, were going to college. It was a working class neighborhood, and, you know, and I think, you know, I don't want to be separated in that way. That's my idea, I think, you know. He didn't even like doing the white collar stuff, and he had all this math and stuff that he had taken. He went into a bank, and he was going to be a teller at first, and he hated it. So he ended up quitting that and going to American Airlines and loading luggage, and that's what he wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. And what is his name?
Richard. He still lives in Astoria. Never moved out of Astoria. I have a couple of cousins, and my niece is still there also, that never moved out, but everybody else, all the other cousins, eventually left.
Scattered to the winds.
Yeah. Now, some didn't go far. Some stayed in New York, they went to the island, Long Island, but, and some to Connecticut, and, you know, upstate New York and nearby, and others like me, like all over the country, all over the place, you know, yeah. But, and that, I'm sure that disturbed my aunts and uncles, and like it did my father. He was, you know, he was just so sad when I told him I loved Atlanta and I wanted to. I'd come down here for Vista, and then I came to go to Emory in graduate school. So that was okay because, you know, you're there for, but then when I said I loved Atlanta and I wanted to move here and stay here, it was like sad just thinking about still, you know, how it made him feel.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
You mentioned really enjoying reading. What sort of books did you read?
You know, I can't remember the early books. Only things I remember are like scatterings, and I don't know why I remember these books. Well, I do. I remember one of them, and why. It was a teacher. You know, we used to have a teacher that, you know, that encouraged you so much in that. So Mrs. Pollock, this was in elementary school, I don't know what grade it was, but I must have been teacher's pet because she gave me a hardcover edition of Alice in Wonderland, the original, you know, large book with the original illustrations and everything. And I remember getting that, like, whoa. So stuff like that I love to read. And Dr. Dolittle was a series that existed back then. I remember reading those. And so I guess there were like series that kids, you know, were given. But then I read all kinds of stuff. I was just really interested. In high school, I remember why I got into psychology is reading Freud and the interpretation of dreams and stuff like that. And I was just like, wow, yeah. So, and I don't know when I started. It must have been in college, really. I don't remember in high school being that oriented toward reading political or leftist or world history or stuff like that, except whatever history you get in school. I don't remember being, so where did I start reading? Because I remember then, you know, it was like the reason I became socialist and felt like I was of the left and was reading about history and about this country and the world and colonialism and the development of what happened in the world. So it must have been between high school and college. And in college, I really didn't do a lot of extracurricular. I did the student help project, which was kind of like this is your way to give to other people. You help young kids who have difficulty reading and who need to have some tutoring. And that's what it was. It was kind of like that kind of anti-war stuff started at that point. But it must have been because what I was reading as I was connecting to these various things. And I always say, and it's very, very true, anybody, I think, my age, what you saw on TV with the civil rights movement was happening, and what was happening with that was just startling, and it was key to me, to what I feel is important even now, and what I wanted to do. Because, you know, the racism in this country and the fact of what kind of country it was. I guess why in New York I didn't know that. I knew there was segregation in New York City, but somehow I didn't think of that in the same sense as Jim Crow and Southern racism and the Klan, and I didn't connect at all. It was like, we're much better than them. We, you know, yes, black people are in the housing project, but so are poor white people. Yeah, because some of my family, some aunts and uncles lived in the public housing. So I guess that was what was in my head. But then seeing on TV the reality, and in fact the reality in New York, and a lot of the conflicts that later on as I grew up were happening right in New York City around race and around white supremacy and the effects of that. It's something that just has stayed with me the whole time. It becomes very important to always keep that in mind and remember and learn more about it and look at what I'm doing. And that came from TV. People always put down TV, but man, you know, that's where I got a lot of information about what was happening. And then reading, catching up on reading what you don't, you know, the news you don't get on TV. So yeah, I think it was mostly in that high school and college where I started seeing the connection with political stuff and social situations with where I lived and who I was, and interesting, because I'm thinking now, when my brother was out of high school, and of course it was Vietnam and the draft, and he was drafted and he got sent to Vietnam. But luckily he didn't. Maybe because of his school background, and I don't know how you get into the place where you're doing some kind of special work in a barrack or an office somewhere versus being in the infantry. But he wasn't in the infantry, so he made it back. But he was in Vietnam while I was being an anti-war activist, which is kind of interesting, to say the least. At that point, I remember us sending back and forth to him. We'd record on a tape recorder messages and say hello to him, and he'd send stuff back to us like that too. So these tapes going back and forth. And when he came back, it's only then when now our neighborhood when we grew up was all white. Almost most of the story was white, except if you got to the housing projects and where you had Latino and black folks also. So I didn't have anything to look at my brother and say, or maybe he wasn't interested enough to even make comments on news and stuff. I don't remember that at all. My father and I would always have discussions about stuff, but my brother, so I have no sense whether he, you know, held any racist views or had that kind of, other than the usual stuff we all get when we grow up as racists in a racist society. But when he came back, he was calling Vietnamese gooks and stuff like that. It was like, whoa. So it became, we were never that close growing up because he was 4 years old and wanted to get rid of me. It's like, don't hang with me, get away from me, you know, and it makes perfect sense. And then he'd have to babysit me sometimes if my parents wanted to go out at night, and he hated that. So it wasn't like we had a real close sister-brother relationship. You know? And I thought later on we might be able to, but then I realized how did we grow up in the same family?
Mhm.
We were so different. That happens a lot, and I always wonder though, what was it? So I'm thinking the difference might have been I went to college, and I started hearing and seeing and talking with other people who weren't white Catholics. A lot more Jews, a lot more people of color. And I was an art major in the high school, and the high school was a mixed high school at that point, still mostly white, Newtown. But there were all kinds of people in the art department. So at least there was some sense, you know, of this is what people are like. Oh, that person I like, that person I don't like. And this is, you know, it's not just those black folks in the housing project are like X, Y, Z. And I have no idea, I'm just hearing this because somebody tells me this. Interesting. Well, I did, actually, the funny thing is, I did get to experience some of, before going to junior high. Junior high is where there was a real mixture of kids because of where it was situated, and it was closer to several public housing communities. Therefore, there were, unfortunately, it was like mostly desegregated by white, black, Hispanic. Those are the three groups. And never the twain shall meet in most cases. And there was also tracking, so they did as much as they could to keep people apart, even in the classes. We didn't understand that's what was tracking. We thought, well, you're smarter, we were in this group, and you're not as smart, you're in that group. But it was a real, almost gang warfare outside of school, sometimes. So it was the real presented of, this is New York, and this is what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how I got off on that, but anyway, that was, my brother hadn't gone to that junior high. I'm thinking, where did he go to junior high? Was it an all-white school? So maybe that, plus me going to school and him not, makes a difference. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense in a way, but my parents weren't people who verbally passed on anti-black or anti-any other. I mean, they weren't like outward racist. They didn't feel that. They in fact were supporting the civil rights movement. They were real upset about all this. So it wasn't like we were learning it from that. But of course, it's clear that my parents were brought up in a racist society just like I was and my brother was. So people looking from the outside of us would have seen probably a lot of that kind of automatic, this is what people are like kind of ideas.
Mm.
And so how did I get to where I would reject totally and understand that's a total made-up story to help suppress certain people, and my brother? I mean, he might know that intellectually too. It's interesting.
Yeah. A couple follow-ups. First, the books and ultimately, I imagine, periodicals that you were reading for enjoyment and to learn, sort of a political analysis of things. Where were you obtaining those? Would you always buy the books or magazines, or was there a library, or?
Oh yeah, library, I'm sure. Both the school and public library were very common. Yeah, I'm assuming especially getting the books, books, because we didn't have a lot of money to buy a bunch of books or anything. But later on, when I myself was, now starting to be on my own, I would subscribe to a magazine, maybe. Well, first of all, when I was young, Mad Magazine was, I mean, that seems like, oh, it's just a comedy thing, but you know, it had a lot of social and political satire. And then I remember Ramparts was something that, one of the first things that I was subscribing to because of its political and social justice analysis. So I guess when I was, you know, as I grew, yeah, as soon as I could afford it, I would subscribe to newspapers. Of course, my parents always got newspapers, bought newspapers, so that was always there. Except the two that we often got were, you know, the Daily News and I don't know what the other one, Daily Mirror. It was the Mirror and the News, and they were both pretty, I'll look at it now, they're both pretty right-wing.
Mm-hmm.
So when I got a little bit more savvy, and I knew a little more, then I would maybe try to read the Village Voice, or try to, you know, New York Times, but my parents, the idea of getting the New York Times to read, like, no, that's not gonna happen, so. Interesting. I never thought of that, like the newspapers when I was growing up and what they were. I wouldn't have gotten a lot of these leftist or progressive ideas at all from reading those things, obviously, yeah, so it had to be. And I wish I remembered more about when my reading changed or how I got to start reading some of that stuff. But I remember when I got here, and Alpha started, I mean, I had all kinds of stuff that I had bought, you know, and collected, and I was donating all my stuff to create the Alpha Library. So it wasn't just all women's literature, it was a lot about other social justice and political kind of, so I put them all in the library. And, who knows where they are now, ended up somewhere. But I think of, you know, really important books that I first read that made me realize something about X, something about Y, something about imperialism, or something about capitalism, or something, you know. But I was never in a communist party or any kind of party situation where you were made to read Marx and Lenin. No, I mean, I might have read a little bit about a book by them, but I think I would have, like, I feel now if I had to read one of those books that's like that, I would have to slit my throat or something, because it's just not, even now, if I start reading something that's really like very intense and articulate and intellectual, and it's like, okay, do I want to spend my time sloshing through this and trying to look up stuff and understand this sentence, or do I just go to a magazine and read an article about the issue? And that's what I rather do.
Yeah.
So it came from different places, I guess. But my brother, like I say, and I don't know that he never read, but whenever I went over to his apartment after he got married, and I never saw like bookcases and books, you know, it's not like that wasn't their thing. They didn't have huge numbers of books and books. So I'm assuming a lot. I assume he just stayed with what most of the people in the working class community did, which is you watch your TV when you're not working, you go to the movies, you go to the bar, and maybe you read some newspapers, you know. I think we were lucky in that we didn't have Fox News and CNN back then. I think we were lucky that we had to watch the news program at night if we wanted the news, and it covered world news and local news, and everybody got the same kind of information, basically. But then you can interpret it in a way that, you know, and maybe then you had to read a little more in depth in a newspaper or, you know, a magazine article, because you only had so much time giving you that information about what was happening. And that's a big difference between us. I'm really very much interested in keeping on. In fact, I wish I had more time to like watch various things that I want to listen to or read more stuff. I don't think my brother was ever into that, although he has a mind that could have done it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of sad, and to me it's sad. I'm sure he wouldn't think it was sad at all. I mean, he had fun living his life. father was very encouraging of everybody, basically, you know. So, although I never asked him about that. I never talked to my father or heard him talk about his disappointment about Richie not going to college. I wonder if he had a big disappointment. Because it wasn't like I was told, no, you go, right? No, it's like I was a girl. I don't have to go to college. I mean, what was I going to do? It was like I said, I want to go to college. I mean, this is not that long ago. This was like in the early 60s,
Yeah,
right? And it
64,
wasn't assumed
right.
like, I mean, so we were both smart kids. You see that from our grades in school and everything. Why wasn't I one being encouraged to go? It's like very strange. Not strange, I mean, I know what it's about, but it seems, I'm glad that I was just interested enough and I liked learning, and it always took me, I had to work at it. I had to read and do homework, and in college I was very involved with all my time being spent doing that. I wasn't one of those, I could just go to a class and then read something like that. No. I had to really work at it, study. But I liked it too, you know. So I'm glad that, you know, that's my prejudice. I'm just thinking that education makes a big difference in a lot of people's lives, and the difference between even people who grow up in whatever particular bias situation they're in. Let's say it's race. They grow up in a racist family that really has that ideology, and that gives them that. If they end up, and this is some stories I've read, they end up going to college or university somewhere, well, all of a sudden they're talking with people who had totally different ideas and backgrounds and stuff, and sometimes that really changes people. They go, whoa, but don't you believe X? No. Why not? This is why. Here, read this. That's not true, you know? So, I wish my niece had gone to college. She also was a very smart kid. I was shocked when I found out she wasn't going to go to college. It's like, I guess my parents didn't. Why should I? You know, I don't know. But so she might have been. She's perfectly happy now, where she ended up. And she's smart enough to, after getting some jobs and learning about insurance and this and that and the other, she opened up her own, like, business insurance thing. She's having a little problem right now because of this thing between Lyft and Uber and the real taxi cab drivers, because her insurance that she was working with was for the Uber drivers and the Lyft people. And in New York now, there's a hiatus or something about that, and anyways. But she, you know, she's smart enough to actually have created her own business, and
yeah.
So again, what would have happened to her if she had gone to university? And I wonder.
So many contingencies. So many contingencies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, any number of things could happen. And she, you know, she was married and never had kids, and it turned out, I found out later, she got divorced, and why she got divorced was her husband was a drug addict. So my father, who died before he got a great-grandchild, because he was just waiting for her to have a kid, you know. And he never got pregnant, and now, I guess she feels she's too old. She didn't want to. She has a partner now, but they're not going to have kids. So.
Yeah. On the subject of your parents and household and the newspapers that they were reading, and also the neighborhood, did there still exist Italian language papers? And did they subscribe to those? Or?
Not that I know of, no. I mean, they might have still existed some, definitely. My grandmother's might have. I don't remember. As you mention it, it seems like, ooh, yeah, was there something I never could read? Or there may well have been, but I can't really. My parents did not know. In fact, my parents had made a decision, I'm sure, not to teach us Italian. We could have been bilingual, and I'm thinking, oh my God, why didn't they, I could have been bilingual. I took Italian in school because I felt like I should know Italian. And they decided that. Now, I don't know particularly the reasons other than the usual that my grandparents both had, like, oh, well, you're here, you need to learn English, and it wasn't, first of all, neither of them had gone on to college. Nobody in their families had gone on to college. I mean, me and my cousins that went were the first people in the family to get to college or university. So the importance of being bilingual was, they probably didn't even have a sense of that. Even if it wasn't like, Italian wasn't, Spanish would have been a lot more useful, but being bilingual in general would have been really helpful. But they used it when they wanted to discuss things that we didn't understand, so they'd speak Italian, so that we couldn't understand it. Yeah, I thought that a long time about, would have been much more cool. It could have changed a whole lot of things. I'm thinking now way ahead of. In college, so in high school, I was taking Italian, and I continued that in college. Don't remember any of it now. Couldn't speak Italian, but when I had changed from being a biology major to an art major. I went back to art. I did art history. I'll be an art major. I could do, And then I found out that you had to take another language. It had to be either Russian or maybe Chinese. But there were some languages that if you're going to be an art historian, you really have to. And it was like I had such difficulty with Italian, with language in general, that I didn't pick up on speaking another language at all easily. So it was always a struggle. So I said, no. That's when I went back to psychology. Like I was interested in that.
Yeah.
That seemed very easy. But what would happen if I was already bilingual? Then I would have had, it probably would have been easier somehow because I'm already bilingual. I had learned somehow. And then I could have taken a third language starting early, maybe have stayed in art, to be an art historian or a curator or something. Interesting how things could have been different.
Yeah.
So,
And what about your parents' politics in general? You mentioned that they certainly were not overt racists in any way.
Yeah, no, I don't think they weren't political in the sense that I'm talking about, social justice. They weren't, no, I shouldn't say that actually, thinking of my father. Okay, so first of all, Democratic. And I assumed everybody in my family is Democratic, because of course, if you're working class and you're at all, what I call progressive now, you're a Democrat. And so that politics they were very much into. They even knew people who ran for office, and would support them. So it was that kind of level of politics. I think, was there any particular... And my father, the way I would think social justice kind of panned out for him was like me and my student health project. You have this, so you help other people who have less, or are less disadvantaged. So he got pulled into the Lions Club. The Lions Club was basically for professional businessmen, but they would allow a small number of people who weren't, in other words, working folks, in. And so he was invited in by one of the family member was like a friend. In fact, he was an attorney who later ran for office and was an elected official for a while. So he got invited in. And he worked for, I remember all growing up, until I left house, he was very involved in the Lions Club. Became, the secretary for a long time. Then he became the president. And they did stuff all the time with, their key charity was Lighthouse and blindness and disability stuff. So he did a lot of that. And he also, it was through the Lions where he got to make some friends other than white people, which is kind of interesting to me. So yeah, in terms of, it's community-based social justice in a sense of, wanting to help and share what you have with other people. So yeah, I guess in that way my father, and like I said, I could tell from, my mother didn't really ever even make comments enough for me to know much about whether she had, what political point of view she had. And my father, who would watch the news and would make comments and would say, and sometimes we'd argue and sometimes, who I could see was very supportive of the civil rights movement and thought that was terrible, what was happening. Probably would not have seen how racist New York City was, because he just didn't feel like that. He worked with people from all different places, I'm trying to think, was Astoria, even when they had moved several times, and they were now, was it really all white still? I'm not sure, because I don't know enough. I think it was still basically white working class, although it might have been started to be gentrified already, because I know by now Long Island City and Astoria are very gentrified. And so my parents couldn't afford to live there because unless they had rent stabilization. They had rent control first and they had rent stabilization. And that's why they could afford to still live in Astoria. And my brother can and my niece can. I think based on that, because it's very expensive now to live there. So it may be maybe still white, but it's now because white folks have more money most of the time to live in those kinds of neighborhoods. But Astoria, where I first lived in Astoria, which is right near Astoria Park, right near the river, that part of Astoria, like I said, it's a lot more Latino now. Well, I say now, I'm thinking back when I moved back there for about 4 or 5 years. That's what it was then, but now it could be gentrified. It's interesting. I don't know about having
back to Atlanta. The last time that you moved back to Atlanta was 2004.
Yeah, no, in 1999 I moved back to New York City, and then in 2004, at the beginning, I moved back. So I was up there for like those 4 or 5 years. And my parents still lived there, like I said, and their landlords were just waiting for them to die or to go away, because then they could raise the rent, because they were under rent stabilization. Now you could raise it so much and they could afford to still live where they were. So I think it was already, although it was still pretty working class. I remember, like when I visited them, when I went to the restaurants over there, when I went to the bars where my brother and sister-in-law still lived. That was their community was the people in the neighborhood and the bars and the sports stuff, and that was, still seemed pretty, working class. Interesting. I wish I had been interested enough, because I was living in another neighborhood now where I could find and afford to lived in Staten Island first, and then when I got to Queens, I lived in a co-op apartment. My cousin had gotten herself a co-op apartment a while back in the area where her parents used to always live. They had bought a co-op way back. And it was one of these co-ops. It was very interesting because it didn't have a management corporation, outside management dealing with it, like a lot of the, like a condo association I have now has a management thing associated with it. The people that owned the co-ops, they ran everything. So it was a lot cheaper than some of the co-ops.
Yeah.
And that's where I was able to get my apartment. But it wasn't in Astoria, so I had to, travel a little bit. What were we talking about?
We were talking about your, sort of the political orientation
Oh, my
and
parents'
activity of
political,
your
yeah.
parents. And you've mentioned a couple times the community largely being white working class and that it was still largely segregated. I wonder, being first generation Italian and in, you know, early mid 20th century in New York City, were you aware of any, or did you hear from your parents of any anti-Italian discrimination, hostility?
My parents would never have talked about that, and they didn't. I've read later, you know, that during World War II, I was shocked when I read, you know, it wasn't just fear, suspicion, or hatred of Nazis, but about the Germans living here, about the Italians living here, and of course we know about what happened to the Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
But that stuff happened to the Italians too. So I didn't know enough back then to ask now, did anything like this happen to you?
And there's
I think I
mythology
asked
about mobs and...
No, I think I asked something to my family at one point about, and it was like they remembered that sometimes people would come to your house, your apartment, and take away a radio if you had a radio. Because the whole idea was if a radio was at all able to do, I forget what it's called now, if you could use it somehow to communicate with somebody else, that maybe infiltrators and traitors and those, you know, fascists were here using that. And so people had stuff confiscated like that. Nobody ever put Italians in a concentration camp, obviously, and Germans in it. But I think stuff like that did happen. And I don't remember hearing anything about anti-Italian. I mean, I just know that from reading in history and being, you know, people being called womps and people being greasy and. But you know, not when I was growing up, obviously, because I was in the middle of the community. And even though there were other, you know, ethnic groups, it was like your ethnicity was, your class was basically the unifying factor, where you were in relation to the rich folks and the powerful folks.
Even in middle school, where you described that there were real tensions among the black kids.
Yeah, in junior high, those kids that were in that junior high, was hardly any that I lived near. You know, except my friend Tizzy, she was a Greek girl. And we would often go to school together because we lived near each other. But yeah, those kids in that school came from all over, so it wasn't like I knew, it was like you knew kids just because you went to classes with them. And I really don't remember having a sense in the school, not outside where the gang warfare would tend to happen, that there was a lot of tension. And that was because they had that tracking system. If you were uneven and said, let's look at all your grades and test scores for the last few years and put people in those classes based on that and mixed black and Hispanic, and you might have had some different feelings, but like, so my classes were all white. And so I remember now, I go, no, there was no, I didn't have any problems in classes. Well, yeah, outside the school, then you had to worry, were people going to be there with the baseball bats and the bricks, or were they going to try to fight, or were they, I was oblivious to how the racism that existed, that I saw on TV in a very obvious way elsewhere, was operating in my very school, oblivious to that. I didn't at that point think, oh, there's tracking here, this is terrible. I think back and I go, well, I did not, I don't know, it was just like everything else. When you're white, everything's invisible to you unless somebody points it out, you know, your privileges. And even though I knew that, you know, and again, I was in this mindset of, even though I had gone visiting my cousins, a couple of families of cousins who lived in a housing project. As soon as they could move out and they had money, they did. But I would go down there, and so they were right there with the other poor folks, you know. They played with some black kids, and I went down, I think it was during junior high, yeah, because it was right. I'd go, down the main avenue from where the school was. I'd go that way to where I lived. Going that way was where the housing projects were. And I remember that I volunteered. I don't know how I even heard about it. Maybe it was somebody who's still living there. I don't know. What they made, I'm trying to remember now. Somebody made an announcement at school. They were looking for people to help. But anyway, the idea was that I would help babysit for some kids while their parents were learning English, a second language kind of thing. Their parents were, and they were mostly Spanish-speaking people. And so I did that for a little while. I'd go and I'd just, I'd stay with the kids, most of whom didn't understand, I may not understand them, but it was like I was just watching them, come back babysitting. And I thought that was, just the right thing to do because these people are learning to learn English and they, they don't have much money and they were poor. And so I was doing that, and yet all this stuff was happening, and I wasn't like saying, but those are the same families probably that these kids in junior high who I'm going with, and I never had an analysis, never thought about it in that way.
Which when you're 12 and 13,
Yeah.
how one does that on their own.
Yeah. So my parents were, they must have been aware of all this, but maybe just as little aware as I was of what the tensions were in neighborhoods where you live bordering another person's neighborhood, where the Hasidic Jews were next to the black neighborhood, and what was that about? And, where Puerto Rican people lived near Central American people. Was there, just oblivious of that kind of reality, except the usual, if you look at the newspapers and you kind of get the sense of it's mostly those darker skinned people who are being arrested and having criminal problems. That was always, like clearly, I'm thinking, was anybody that I even knew in my neighborhood ever arrested, like for something? Probably were, but I was like, I'm sure if that happened, that was like nobody would say anything. They would try to cover it, to keep it quiet. That so-and-so was found having drugs or something. But I don't remember police being an issue that we thought, oh, the police, terrible. No, police were like, oh, police, friendly policemen, you get the help, Yeah. And we were the police, at least when I was growing up. There weren't a lot of people, colored police people.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this is like, wasn't that different from the South. You just didn't have the accent and didn't have the overt, people willing to admit that their family was in the Klan. And, I'm not going to send my kids to, And that was clear. My parents weren't ever thinking, you can't go to that school because there's too many black kids. That was never a thing. So that's why I say it seemed like they weren't the kind of racists that when you think of the Klan and when you think of people who say white people are just more intelligent white people, they just weren't like that. They just absorbed, the usual stuff about who people were. Until they got to know, I think that changed too when my parents got to be friends through the Lions Club. It was almost always, I can't think of where else they would have, except maybe at work if they probably knew a lot of people of different nationalities and ethnicities at work also. My mother worked in Manhattan. My father just, wherever subway, he was sent to. And I'm sure they had, friends at work and then friends through the Lions Club that, weren't all Italian and weren't all white. So you just get to realize, as soon as you get to know some people outside of your group, there's certain things start falling away. You just can't, well, you can make exception. They're the exception.
Mm-hmm.
People do that, but I don't know if that my parents did that. I never heard them say, I never heard the words and the kind of ideas expressed by them that would make me say, they really have a white supremacist ideology. No, that wasn't. Not that there might have been in the neighborhood. It wasn't, because we were an all-white neighborhood, it wasn't like something that had to even be dealt with or expressed, even if there were, you know what I mean? It was hard to know. But my brother sure did pick it up. And whether he had that before he went to Vietnam, I don't know. I never heard him saying racist stuff, but when he got back, and that, you know, it's like surprising to me. And I don't know, I assumed, and maybe this was a wrong assumption, that many also, because I had some aunts and uncles I had, especially there's an uncle I'm thinking of in mind, but other ones too, who were pretty racist. I mean, they wouldn't try to hide it. So I wonder whether he and his friendship network, that was a pretty okay and common thing, and that he went over there with it, and that's why it was so easy to, or whether it was these were the enemy and you had to make them inhuman so that it would be okay to be over there and do what you were doing. I don't know. I assumed that it meant he was also just racist in general. It wasn't just Asian folks that he thought were, you know, gooks, animals, but maybe some other folks too.
Right.
And I don't know whether that's true or not. Certainly he would say that wasn't true. I'm sure if I talked to him and asked him about it. We don't talk about politics. Because my niece is now her partner, and they're probably not going to get married, but they really love each other and they're together, is a half black, half, I'm not sure if it's Puerto Rican or if it's some other Latino, but he's clearly, you can tell that he would be considered a black person by most people here, and he has like a lot of black family, and that seems like perfectly okay. Nothing unusual about that, you know. So, who knows? Who knows? I think the difference is a lack of consciousness of having looked at and studying the idea, history of white supremacy, and what that means now, and how it's infiltrated and incorporated in the society. So my brother may not have been interested in reading about that or learning about it, but he also understands that these are all human beings, they're all the same, and, you know. I'm making assumptions.
On the subject of politics, and we've been discussing a lot about racial politics, but what about the issue of the war in Vietnam and your brother being drafted and going,
Mm-hmm.
and you at this point being very clearly anti-war? Where did your parents fall into?
I don't remember a lot of discussion about it. I think it might have been one of the things that me and my father had disagreements about when we watched the news and stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was, I don't have remembrances of specifically him saying, we need to be there to stop communism. I don't remember that kind of stuff, except his son was over there. I'm going to support, you know, the war and what we're doing. So I think it was like for most military families, it's not an ideological thing. If they become ideological, it's because they use that to kind of bolster the fact of why my son and daughter is over there, or why we're serving. We have to believe that it's for a good reason. But I believe it was more of, well, first of all, that was back in the draft, so that was different. Now it's like, do you go into the Army because you believe in the U.S. got to defend ourselves and fight those, or do you go in because it's a great way to have some kind of basis, to get an education, to have a job, And a lot of people do that. I think that's why mostly working class folks are still the people that join the Army. So, you know, I think my parents didn't ever express like the McCarthyist, you know, anti-communist kind of thing when they lived through that. I think they very much saw that as a very horrible kind of way that we dealt with somebody having a different political ideology and stuff. They were, and they were always pro-union, they were always in that way, what I call leftists, are always, you know, in that way. And I even had, there might have been a couple of people in the father's family who were, you know, like pro-communist, and were communist in the CP maybe, or I seem to feel like that probably was true. I don't know, because they were very much union people, and they were very into that kind of organizing and stuff. So I never remembered him about the war having that analysis, but it was more like, well, this country is over there, and we're fighting, and we need to support, you know, our troops and what we're doing, because, and it was more based on, you know, our sons and daughters are over there, our sons in that case, you know, we're gonna support them, and we're gonna say that it's right that we're over there. I mean, that's, you know, I tell you, I have a cousin, Linda, who we're in touch through Facebook mostly. Once in a blue moon, we might actually talk, but she's, in fact, she's one of the families who lived in a housing project at first, and then they got enough money to move out. She had two brothers. Her brother Raymond was my brother's age, and then she had a brother Dennis, who's a little younger than my brother, maybe between my brother and me. And he went to Vietnam. I found out later. Several of my cousins, male cousins, went to Vietnam. But I found out later that why he had died was not from being killed while he was over there. He was in infantry and they got injured, bad injury, and then had been given narcotics, strong narcotics for pain. And he started shooting up. He became addicted and then got AIDS because of using the needles he did. And he died with AIDS. And my cousin, Linda, will never forgive Jane Fonda because of her support in going over there and supporting the National Liberation Front and the anti-war stuff. I mean, she just hates the people. And I think it's not because she has this, I mean, otherwise, from what I gather from everything when she looks at my stuff, and she's not progressive, she's not conservative politically, you know, in terms of social justice and stuff, but her brother went over there and died from, I would say, I don't know if she says it, died from that war. And he didn't have the injuries he did, he wouldn't have gotten addicted, he wouldn't have, you know. So that's what I think where most families were about Vietnam. I don't think there were a lot of extreme anti-communists, right, that sent their sons over, let's go beat those commies. I don't think so.
And in the formation of your political perspective, several minutes ago we were talking about the books that you were reading, and you mentioned the Alpha Library, and said that there were several books that, you know, that book was really important in, you know, providing this insight or that insight. Do you recall the titles or authors of any of those?
I wish my memory was such that I could pull stuff up. It was a lot of stuff around colonialism and imperialism and the history of this country and other countries, European countries in the world, and what that meant. And then maybe getting more into also finding out about not only Africa as a place where there were these civilizations that existed long before other civilizations, and what that meant in terms of how Europe invaded and took over stuff, but also the ancient history of how the indigenous folks of the Americas got to where they are, and what happened when Europeans, you know, came and changed, so all that stuff. I remember Franz Fanon, I mean, reading, you know, his stuff, and I can't even remember the name of the book that I'm thinking of, about Algiers and...
Wretched of the Earth? Wretched of the Earth?
Yes, Wretched of the Earth. Stuff like that. Later on, maybe the autobiography of Malcolm X, when I, you know, started getting into reading more by Black folks and about Black history. Yeah, early, I'm just I guess from reading Ramparts, you know, I think
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
get a lot of that kind of leftist history and analysis. And wish I could remember some of the other things that really,
Yeah.
in my brain.
So, I guess, yeah, another question, somewhat in line. Are there particular figures, people, events in your childhood, early adulthood that were particularly influential? You've mentioned what I have gathered to be a close relationship with your father, and you also mentioned your teacher, Mrs. Pollock. But were there any other people that were intimate in your life, or even national figures, city, just folks that were events that really had made a mark on you?
You know, there are certain teachers that I always liked a lot, but I don't remember the other teachers that I'm thinking of being influential in relation to social justice stuff. It was always around just whatever classes I was taking, or the kind of person they were in terms of how they taught. I don't even remember when this happened. I don't remember what years this was. I remember a lot of things happening in New York City in relation to school inequality, is what I call it now. And I remember thinking, wow, it's really such a interesting conflict between the teachers' union that was white controlled, kind of the heads of the union were white folks, so white folks. And you would think you want to support the teachers' union when they're fighting against any particular, but there was a strike, and it was mostly going to be affecting Black and brown folks and their schools. And those people in those communities turned around and said, we're keeping our schools open, fuck you. And they asked for people who would want to help come, anybody, I mean, I didn't have any teaching credential, to go and to be teachers so that there's people, their students, their sons and daughters could go to school. And because it was Brownsville, Ocean Hill. That's how I remember. It was the campaign was, there was a name to it, and I'm forgetting the name now. But it was about the teacher strike, and about what it was about versus what the people in those neighborhoods wanted to happen in their schools. And so I went, and I forget what year it was, but volunteered to be, you know, to be a teacher, to go and be a substitute, you know, for the teachers, so the kids can come in and that, I mean, I remember feeling very much like, this is really teaching me. The first inkling I got of the difference, and this is where you live, this is where I live, and I never knew anything about that, was when I went to the projects, you know. And then when I did student health project, because I ended up being in Corona, a neighborhood in Queens, which is actually right next to the neighborhood I ended up living in when I moved back there, East Elmhurst. But Corona was a black neighborhood, and I went there to tutor, you know, that young kid that I was tutoring. So I got some sense of his family and the area. And now I was going into, I don't know, it was Ocean Hill or Brownsville, it was, you know, an all-black area in Brooklyn. Tough neighborhood, you know, kind of thing. And so I got to experience those kids and how they responded to me, because I was this white lady. What were you doing here, you white lady, you know? So it was, I remember them chanting a lot. You know, I would be very encouraging to all kinds of stuff, and discussions happening, and bringing things that might be interesting. But they would start chanting, like bing, bing, bang, bang, gawa, black power. And there would be that kind of, and chanting along, you know. And I was sometimes wondering, how much is this I'm joining, or should I, or is it about me? And, you know, what are you doing here? So it was a very interesting and educational experience and period of time. And maybe it was one example, although I didn't see it at that point. I didn't have a wider view of the clashes between class and race, and how, no, it isn't true that all working class people all have the same interests at heart. We should all work together because, you know, because no, that wasn't the situation. There was a lot of racism in relation to how the schools were situated, the tracking that always occurred, how some were becoming, and even back then, you know, all black schools, you know, so it wasn't like the South only needed integration. We never did that, you know, wherever we were. I didn't have that kind of broad analysis, but I did see that clash, and so it made me, I guess, want to learn and read more, and knowing a little bit history makes you understand how the white people in power that always have been in power, one way to stay in power is to make sure that the people that don't have a lot of money, which is most of the people, do not see themselves as allies and want to work together, but that they see the racial stuff is going to be important and they should divide them. So I think that was an example. Well, maybe I, at that point, thought leftist politics class was a good analysis, and that the importance was to try to understand the racism, but understand how those two intersected and how you help people want to have coalition and work together and have a union that works for everybody, you know, instead of just certain people. There were always unions in New York, I gather now. I didn't know back then even that it was hard for black folk to get into the union, to get to jobs, to good jobs, because they couldn't get into the union. Or they would be treated differently. You know, it's the same thing of working anywhere, like, okay, we have to let them in now, because there's a law now, and we have to, but the way you're treated and who you know and how you're allowed into certain things and how you get, is still totally different. And we can keep you at a lower level because we know how to do that without being obvious, you know, at least they think you're not being obvious. So, yeah, I can't think of really specific events except things that happen in the news, the big events like that, like the war, what was happening with the war, like a teacher strike and what was happening civil rights movement and the Black Power movement after that. And I got very much into understanding the Black Panther Party because being a leftist, I said, oh, this is that's what they are. They have a class analysis and a left analysis, and they're trying to see Black people understand that and develop programs around it. So I was a big supporter, of Black Panthers, and would go to marches and demonstrations, in New York. I think that was one of the most successful, potentially successful organizations and movements that existed because of the way they did see, even though they were the Black Panthers, they were the Black community, that's what they were focused on, their analysis was, no, white allies are very important. We're part of this larger system internationally and here. So we're not saying, white people, you're the devil, get out of here, and, no, we're working in connection with that. And I think that people in power here in the government saw that. That movement was one of the biggest threats to changing what was going on. And so that's when they, decided, fuck this, we're zomping on them. We're not going to let them get away with anything, and did all that infiltrating and causing so many of the divisions and the problems that eventually, tore them apart.
Mm.
So, that was then at that time I was in Vista, and they got to meet some other folks who either were more like hippie type people or more very political people. Both were kind of going into this domestic Peace Corps, as they used to call it. I think you asked about people, and I'm thinking there probably were a lot, but why individuals are not standing out, I don't know.
What about, and we can move to a different topic, but possibly a different tack to it would be, were you particularly affected by any musicians, particular films, albums, art,
Interesting.
that sort of thing that was popular at the time?
Again, it's probably too far back to really remember. All I remember really is that what attracted me to music was the music of the time: rock and roll, R&B, soul music, and that's what I enjoyed. And thinking back at those times, a lot of the songs back then were very much social commentary. They weren't just all love songs, and so it's much like rap now, I think, in terms of how it has some kind of a message, and that's what, so I remember being attracted to that, obviously. And I like all kinds of music, but when I go and listen to radio now and I want to listen to oldies, it's Soul Town. I mean, it's like R&B and Motown, soul music. Later on, it became women's music because that whole change in women being able to record and talk about feminism, but early on, it was like I would never, and I didn't see most New Yorkers as being like country music fans, even though that was the white music. No, most of them, we all grew up with a mixture of stuff, whether it be rock bands or soul music, R&B, jazz. I mean, that's what. So it was a real mixture of musical cultures, and that's the kind of music I like.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember also, like, in terms of folk music people, when I really got into the social justice stuff, of course, I wanted to listen to people who consciously had songs and music that were relation. So, you know, the usual people, but I'm trying to pull up his name. Because people think of Bob Dylan a lot, but the person that Phil Oakes is who I really, really admired and loved. So it was that kind of music.
Yeah.
It wasn't dance music, it was more, you know, because of, you know, who you were, and yes, this was a great, listen to the song, you know, it says a lot about that issue, or whatever, and in a really good way. So yeah, there's protest music, as they used to call it, protest music.
And did you go to many concerts, or?
No, I mean, no, only ever went to concerts, listened to radio. I mean, I think that was just a money thing, you know, it costs money to go to. In New York, you can go to all kinds of cultural stuff, but in New York City, it costs a lot of money to go to theater, to opera, or even to a concert. So you have radio, you have all the music you want on the radio, you know. Or you could buy your little 45s, you know. And we had a record player and we could buy some stuff. But no, yeah, concerts. That's interesting. Movies was the outside entertainment. We had 2 big movie theaters in Astoria, not far from where we lived, and I would always be there, going to. That was pretty cheap, you know, until recently. I mean, I can't remember, it was like $1 to go to a movie or something, you know. Double feature. No.
I imagine if that, yeah.
Yeah, maybe cheaper. It depends on what year we're talking about, but yeah. Now, and interestingly enough, my parents would, like, okay, the Lions Club did have events and they had dances and they had, you know, so they'd go to those. But earlier on, before my father was in that, like I said, there was this, and I just heard stories about it because I was much too young, even when that still existed, to really know about it. But that neighborhood association would have like dances and events and get-togethers. So that was someplace that they would go. My father was a moviegoer too, and he's the one that got me interested, I think, in movies. And so we'd go together sometimes, and otherwise we'd watch what was called the early show. That was playing during the time when we would have dinner TV. So we would watch that movie a lot. That's when I learned to like the kind of stuff that he liked. And
Which was what?
it wasn't, you know, it was stuff like Doris Day and Rock Hudson and you know, comedies and Alfred Hitchcock and yeah, stuff like that. Alfred Hitchcock, he loved Hitchcock. So. And that kind of, you know, the thing is, people put down TV so much. I think people are ostentatious when they, TV, oh, terrible, it ruined your minds, it's ruined the whole generation. I think that's bullshit, myself. You got a lot of good stuff on TV. The variety shows with a lot of good entertainment and comedy shows, and the news was always challenging. And even now, I mean, there's so much you can choose from. People say, oh, it's garbage. No, there's some amazing things that you can get on TV. Amazing, wonderful things. So I think it was part of my education, actually, part of most education, to people who grew up when TV started and going, TV, wow. It wasn't just radio. You know, you could visualize, and I think that's why I got visually oriented. I'm very visually oriented. I love movies and theater and things that, you know, art, and very visual. I think it's because TV was the entertainment we had. I think of some of the old variety and comedy shows. Amazing stuff. Steve Allen, what a great, just really good people, amazing brains and comedy. Anyway, so I put my little word in for TV is not trash, total trash. It can be, depends what you look at.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I think just as affected by things and people I saw on TV is, like teachers and people I knew. Interesting. But, so individuals like Martin Luther King and like, Rosa Parks and like Fannie Lou Hamer, and seeing those people doing what they were doing. Malcolm X. Malcolm X I was a little scared of because all I heard was what the newspaper that I read and what I saw on TV, which is always that the white devil and we hate you, it's that kind of, it's like, whoa. It was only later when I got to actually read past that or understand and see something more about him that I could see the fullness of what he was about, especially as he decided, to leave the Nation of Islam because of what was happening there and his, it seemed like change in how he saw allies. Anyway, people disagree with that, but those kind of figures definitely had a big effect on me. It's like, wow, people can do this. And the Black Panthers in New York, both women and men, and how even though I didn't have a full, deep understanding because I'm not part of that group, and I'm just looking from the outside, like as an ally, I can see that these people not only believe so strongly but they would be willing to get arrested and get put in jail. But they're actually affecting hundreds of people and young kids and doing stuff that the government is not able to do, and showing that you can develop this whole system. Imagine if the government's money put its efforts behind doing this kind of breakfast programs and free medical care and that kind of stuff. So I thought, wow, I looked up to those folks. And looked up to the people who were leading into Alpha story that went to the Renzo Ramos Brigade, who were going to Cuba to support, instead of trying to tear down this new revolutionary attempt at, changing how a society would lift up its people. So when I had decided to move back here and live here in Atlanta, I'm thinking the first, it didn't come out until 71, I guess. It was late 71 probably, and Alpha started in 72. I'm trying to think of the first community, and the first people I knew were from Emory because I was in graduate school a couple of years. And I lived in Virginia Highland area with a House of Women. And I'm not sure how I got, again, connected to that larger community of the people that started the Bird, and because I found out about the newspaper. WRFG, people that were in that, forming the radio station. I was in, when I told you in Vista we had started this Atlantic Cooperative Food Project, that was still operating. And there were buying clubs all over the city, and Little Five Points had a buying club. This was before Seven Onda. It's one of the things that actually led into Seven Onda for me. And I remember meeting people to decide, oh, buying club, yeah, well, of course, it's part of ACFP, I gotta be in the buying club. And meeting a lot of women through that. And these were the women who had been on the Bench Ramos Brigade, who had been in SDS, who had been in the anti-war movement, who had been in all kinds of other, social justice. And some of them had been on Bench Ramos Brigade, so it was like really interesting to me. And then they were all coming out. Some of them, a lot of them were coming out. Like, oh. So hearing about what some of those women had done in their stories before, and the ones that were a few years older than me especially, who had actually done civil rights movement stuff, I was like, oh wow. Because it was like, oh, I wanted, like when I was in high school, if I had said to my parents, I'm going to go down to Mississippi, and said, oh no, the fuck you're not, no, you're crazy. But when I was, now out of college, even though I was still living at home, and said, I want to go into Vista, and they were going to send me to Georgia, they really couldn't tell me I couldn't do that. They tried to talk me out of it, It still seemed scary to them to go down to the South. All that stuff's happening, all bad things.
How did you hear about Vista?
I have no memory. That's interesting. I have no memory. How did I hear about it?
Do you know whether you got to...
Maybe at school, maybe at school.
Yeah, sort of like in colleges, military recruiters come on campus, like
Yeah,
maybe
did
they
they
had...
recruit? Did they, interesting, I don't remember at all. Did I see something on TV, because there may have been something on TV about Vista, this new program, because it was fairly new at that time,
Mhm.
part of the war on poverty. Well, so learning anything about the war on poverty, you probably saw this name and it was like, oh. In fact, my parents, I'm thinking, did I even think of the Peace Corps, and they might have been like, that's a good thing, I guess, if you want to do that. But then it was like the domestic Peace Corps. Oh, you could stay here and work on poverty right here, but where I heard it, I have no memory, really. It's interesting. Was it because I heard something on TV? Was I read something in the newspaper? Somebody came to the college, and that seems likely. Because I'm thinking it was 68 when I graduated, and it was a lot of things happened that year. MLK. And I was going down to Atlanta right after that, right, that he got assassinated. But also, that summer, Scherner, Goodman, and Cheney had been killed, and Goodman was a student at Queens College. So there was, 64. That was 64 when I started at Queens. That happened. In 68 was when MLK got assassinated. So there was, there was a connection with that school and stuff that was going on. So I wouldn't be surprised if, someone had come to school and had talked it up with people that they knew were in other, kind of related projects, or because like a student health project, but also I was in some anti-war. I don't know if the group was really not based in, there wasn't a lot of political stuff that I remember happening at Queens College. Very interesting. Although it was an anti-war stuff, it was outside. It was some, I don't know if I'm remembering right or not, but that's what I remember. Maybe because I was so involved with studying when I was there. It was like, that was most of my attention, was taking the classes and studying, so it wasn't
Did you ever have part-time jobs or in high school and college?
Yeah, in high school, I think I had, the first job I ever had was during the summer sometimes you could get a temporary job. So I worked up in Steinway. Steinway was the big shopping district in Astoria. Steinway. It's where the two big theaters were too. So I got a job working out in the clothing store at Steinway. But when I was going to college, no, I didn't. I had that scholarship. It didn't cost a lot of money anyway, but I had the scholarship. So it's not like I had to, it's like my parents said, hey, you should go work to earn the money to pay for, it wasn't that much. It was buying some books, you know. But I not work at all during college. It's interesting you're asking that, because I'm thinking, I don't remember doing any jobs.
Did your scholarship come with a little money to buy books and like pay your subway fare?
No, I just remember getting it paid for whatever the tuition was, which is very low. And maybe there was, maybe because that was so low, there was money that helped with the books too. It's very possible.
And I guess your parents supported you, like you lived with them and
Yeah,
they might give you some
yeah.
money for
I'm sure that they were both
entertainment.
working still, so,
Mhm.
yeah.
So when you joined Vista, do you recall whether you had the opportunity to give your input of like, I'd be interested in going to California or to Ohio or?
Yeah, you get to say, this is where I'd like to be,
Mhm.
but that wasn't, you know, that, you weren't guaranteed.
Right.
And
So was the South or Atlanta?
now I'm trying to think now, what did I say? Did I want to work in the South specifically? Or did I say I wanted to work in the North? I don't remember. I think pretty sure I probably said the South because that's where I ended up being sent. It wasn't like there was a whole lot of huge numbers of people trying to get in and they were turning people away. I really don't remember. I probably did because I said, oh, I want to be down, you know, yeah, this is where. But I didn't think I would be in Atlanta, it's like a fairly big city, and that's where we get trained. We got said to be trained in Atlanta. And I thought I'd be, but no, I ended up actually staying and working in Atlanta. So that was kind of, I thought I'd be in like the real South, you know, I mean. So that was interesting that when I went down to get trained, I didn't realize where I would actually end up. I might be sent to another state or some rural area. But then they kept a whole bunch of us right there in Atlanta. And they had people assigned to neighborhoods, most of which were public housing projects, again, based on a public housing project, but that was centered, or very old traditional poor neighborhoods like Cabbagetown, which was then still a white mill town, little neighborhood. So there was a vista there. And I don't know whether they did that because they had a plan in mind, although we were never, it was not like we were told, here's the overall picture, this is the plan, you're all gonna try to coordinate X, Y, Z, nothing like that. I'm shocked at it now, I'm thinking, they just let us go out and just start, like, what are you, crazy? Just go out and community organize.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
And then
figure it out yourself.
Yeah, we ended up doing a buying club and having a lot of people do buying clubs. I don't even know how that happened. I guess we were communicating with each other. We meet occasionally, we talk to each other, you know. So it was good that happened, but it wasn't like Vista management was saying, why don't you all do this? And John Sweet was real instrumental in. I mean, he had a much better, broader picture in his head. I remember him being someone who really kind of pushed that we needed to have a citywide cooperative based on all these buying clubs that were forming. So he was real instrumental in that.
And he stayed in Atlanta and went on to be very influential.
And he went to law school like I did also, but he actually stayed an attorney and did a lot of progressive legal work, as well as becoming a city council person.
Right. So how did you get to Atlanta the first time? Did you drive down? Did your parents take a bus, a train?
No, I mean, when I went to Vista, I flew down.
Okay.
I didn't have a car. I'm thinking back, I'm just amazed. My father that might have been the first car I got. He always bought like a used car to sell. But then when he was around long enough, he would want to give it away, right? So I came down here by myself, and I just had me and my bike or whatever to get around. But he actually gave me his car when I was down. So then I had a car, just a special kind of, that was my first car. I remember what it was, I don't know.
Did he drive it down for you, or you?
Yeah. But anyway, you asked, I'm sorry, you were asking it first.
Just about Vista and how you came to be in Vista. What I'm curious about now is if you can tell me about your impressions of the city when you first got here. Like where did you live, and then what did you think of this place?
Well, I mean, you could tell because I'm here, and this is where I lived, and I loved Atlanta. Now, so I remember is yes, I flew in. I always tell this story. I might have told it in the other one also, but when I was on the plane and the plane started saying, "Okay, we're going to start our descent now into Atlanta." Oh, I always take a window seat because I like looking out. And I'm looking out and I'm going, "So where's Atlanta? Where's Atlanta?" And we're going down. It's like just green trees and forests. And where the hell's Atlanta? Where's Atlanta? Finally, I see some tall buildings, It was downtown Atlanta, had a few tall buildings at that time. And hardly, I mean, it's like, I'm from New York City. I'm looking, where's the city? So there's some buildings and, wow. And then we turn and we're landing. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. First of all, it's small, I think, compared to, right? It's supposed to be a big city. And it's so beautiful. And the air was very clear. And so, I mean, I loved Atlanta because, not only because it was green and it seemed more healthy for living, but even in the neighborhoods where you'd say, this is kind of like, this is right near downtown, it was still like green, trees everywhere, and it was like, that's amazing. And the pace was, Southern pace is more my line, actually. From New York, I mean, I really, it's crazy up there to me. So I loved it, and then I worked with all these people that I got to meet in the neighborhoods I lived in and worked in, and I loved Atlanta people, and I loved the city, and so I wanted to move down here. When you first get there for training, you get placed with a community family somewhere that had volunteered to take in visitors. And where I lived is somewhere in Northwest, and I can't even remember the name of the neighborhood now. I wish I could remember because I'd love to go, find that neighborhood again. It wasn't though. It was probably not far from Perry Homes. You know what Perry Homes was? Maybe south of that. But anyway. And then when I got assigned to work, it was West End, so that's where I lived. And interesting because West End, from what my memory is, that it was, and who knows earlier, it had a different history earlier, but when we got there, it was, and the housing project worked in Harris Homes, was very much like this. It was changing from white to black. In other words, it was like a white flight thing, and and even though the housing project, of course, couldn't legally segregate and couldn't keep out black folks into it was all based on income, they had managed to segregate it anyway, because all the families in the south part on Sells Avenue, they were black, and all the families on the north part, which is up on the west end, they were all white. It was like amazing. And it was like, when I saw it, I was like, what, this happened by accident or something? You get to choose where you live. People were choosing to live with their own, I don't know. So it was like, whoa. And the neighborhoods around, too, I think were still mixed in that sense. And it even while the year and a half or whatever I was there, it really, you could see the change to more and more black people moving in.
And what month did you arrive in '68? What month?
It was in the early fall, like at the end. I think I even had to go to summer school to get my final. I never went to the graduation ceremony because I still had some courses to take, so it was probably like in early fall.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I remember anyway.
And with Vista, the community, as you described it, was still segregated. were you able to work with both populations within the city?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, sure. Well, first of all, that's what this was about. It was about working with poor folks, and it wasn't about a particular race of folks. So Harris Homes was built in because it had both black, there wasn't many other than black and white back then. I don't remember any Asian or Latino people, I don't remember. So it was black and white. And yeah, first of all, the way, there's a CAP agency here, EOA, Economic Opportunity Atlanta, that managed this whole thing. And so you worked with the EOA office in your neighborhood, which covered a lot more area than just Harris Homes, where I was particularly focused on. And there was the staff in the EOA was a mixed staff. The neighborhood around, depending on where you were, was also mixed black and white. I remember when I first moved in, I lived temporarily with a Vista that was still there and was going to be leaving. And the area we lived in, we were probably the only white people kind of in that apartment complex there. And later I lived with a black woman when I moved. And so, in fact, I'm thinking were there white people still in that? I don't even remember. I'm sure there were areas where it was basically still white. But Harris Homes was still like that. And yeah, it was a matter of, and people knew each other because there would be community events happening at Harris Homes. They'd have a picnic, they'd have a Halloween ceremony, a party. So people kind of knew each other, even though the housing seemed to be almost like, segregated. Living in the same, it's all in a, it's not a big area, a few blocks. So yeah, and it was very important, of course, to make sure you didn't just work with one race of people. That would have been like really defeating a lot of the value of organizing. So yeah, and I know that some of those white people there were probably as racist as hell. But in terms of they want to be in a food court to save money and to get, yeah, I don't mind being with black people in a food court, Yeah. And there was I know there was more, I felt there were maybe more prejudice among some white people for Yankees than there were for black folks who were Southerners. As soon as they heard me talk, they knew where I was from. So it was like a little suspicion there, getting past some of that. And I remember one white family specifically, he got real involved. He wanted to be real involved in the stuff that was going on. Had a lot of kids, and she had a husband. And that, I'm saying, that's unusual. Yeah, there were a lot of single family mothers, a lot of households. So there were some that actually had a wife and husband. That was unusual. But he was, his name was Stepatsky, and he was from like New Jersey or something. So she was, people would talk about her, people would laugh and make fun of her because she was married to this Yankee who talked like he did. And so I had to learn how to actually understand. A lot of them they were from rural Georgia especially. It was like almost a different language. It was like, whoa, what are they saying? And they probably had the same problem with me. Like, I was probably talking a lot faster, and So it was kind of interesting. And then the Southern accent, the black Southern accent, the white Southern accent. It was me, I was the outsider. It was all different. So everybody would kind of treat me in a certain way and see, what is she going to be like? Because they were used to Vistas by then. They had other Vistas who had been there. And luckily, they obviously were good folks who people liked, so that it wasn't like I wasn't receiving another Vista. It was like a positive thing. Oh, they're here to really help us get somewhere. So, yeah, and there was a nearby youth center, which is a church-based youth center called Shepherd's Gate on Lawton Street. And it seemed to be, at least from the EOA office perspective, very key to kind of, a lot of people from that housing project and other areas had kids that were going there. So I became kind of involved with, going there, and Vistas would go there, and in their discussion groups would be there, but it was typical for, I think, the South of Atlanta, all these religious-based groups who would do this kind of work. So everything was Christian. And then there were community members that, outside of Harris Homes, that also kind of had gotten involved. They just decided they wanted to help with community stuff and whatever was going on. So they didn't live in Harris Homes, but they would live nearby. And they would kind of be part of, to know people who didn't even have to do with VISTA or EOA, but kind of knew EOA because it was a poverty program, and they were working in those areas, and other groups, like a Emmaus House. And I got to be friends with a guy from Emmaus House real early, who would call into our house a lot, and we would always do things together. And the people that were still doing civil rights type work, and would, because we were right, where Harris Homes was, and where I lived was right near Spelman and Morehouse and Morris Brown and all that. So with a lot of people related to that who kind of we got to know and worked in the neighborhood, and the people who, Pascal's was their headquarters. Pascal's restaurant were always a place where people would meet and would have conferences and have campaign meetings about, various civil rights and economic, programs that they were, and usually that, if it was economic, it probably worked in relationship to EOA, because that was where the federal money was coming into EOA, so we're going to try to relate to it in some way and help get funds, to develop whatever in your neighborhood or my neighborhood. So that's how I got to know something, and I really love the people that I got to know in the neighborhood, and also in the social justice network. So, and Atlanta was, like I said, I remember flying in from when I came and moved back, and when I actually drove my car back down when I moved back, but there was a time when I was flying in and remembering the difference in, because now, and this was some years ago, I don't know if we've improved it any, but it looked more like LA, because I'd been out to LA for 3 years. It looked more like LA because it was such a brown layer of pollution all around Atlanta. There was still a lot of green flying in everywhere. I mean, until you got really to Atlanta. Now, Atlanta had grown, so it was now outside the perimeter, and so there was less green, but it really stayed very different from like a New York City and LA, the kind of thing I was, used to otherwise in a big city. But it was much more polluted, so kind of a sad comparison.
Yeah. So in that year and a half, so I guess between sort of September '68 and...
I was going to say a second year in Vista, but then that's a whole personal thing of things that happened to me, and I decided, I was just heartbroken, and I couldn't stay. So it was like January of that year.
Of 70?
I moved back. So 68, 69, so January of 70, something like that. And I came back later that year in the summer, because I was going to start in Emory.
Mm-hmm. So in that year and a half between the fall of 68 and 70, you were getting to know a lot of people, particularly doing the VISTA work and community-based work. Had you,
But not the people, interesting enough, I don't remember knowing back then, maybe I'm wrong, that I know about the bird. Interesting. I can't remember. I know there were some other visitors that I know would have found out about the bird, because they were more like the hippie type,
mm-hmm.
and that was what I pictured the bird people selling birds were about. They were the hippies. So I might have then known about the bird, but I'm not really sure.
And I think that there was at least there was a business or two in the West End that they would drop off.
Yeah,
a
so
bundle.
maybe that's
so
how
there were some.
But never got involved. See, I didn't get involved with those folks or people that started WRFG. I wasn't. Only in that co-op thing that I have connection with anybody else. And I don't remember, I certainly didn't meet any of the women that I met later on when I moved back to Atlanta.
And you don't recall reading The Bird or?
No, but it's very possible I'm just not remembering because I remember The Bird real well when I moved back, and the strip was still there, and even going and trying to sell some birds sometimes when I didn't have a job, But that, I don't remember when I was in Vista, I was just involved in West End, and I didn't go out of West End very much.
Okay. But then when you moved back in the summer of 1970, you come back to pursue graduate studies in psychology at Emory.
Right.
And did you?
And so my first thing was, that's who I knew, the people who were other students. But because we were living in Virginia Highlands, and because there was this buying co-op that was operating at that point at Little Five Points, then I started to get to know other social justice folks who were in that kind of network and in that neighborhood. And so even though I was living for most of that time, before I dropped out, with other students, Emory students, I still was getting to see and know other folks, and something about Little Five Points and what it was, and I'm trying to remember though how the bird came into it, because that's interesting. It's not a real clear. That's when, of course, as soon as I got into a place where people were then reading it, so as soon as I saw it, it was like, oh, and this is where they produce it, and then who was the first person I got to know from the bird? I can't remember that at all. That's interesting. I have very loosely. I'm afraid I can't tell you, this is how I found out about the bird, and this is how I found out they had openings for people who wanted to work there. Because the first thing I did when I got back here, and I wasn't in school anymore, I said, I gotta get a job. And I didn't, it was like a job to make money to live on. So I applied for stuff in the state jobs, looked at those kind of jobs. And I think one of the first things I did was, it was a temporary, only didn't last long. Why did I leave that? I'm trying to think now. I must have had another job I was going to go to. But anyway, it was in a laboratory. It was a lab assistant job, working with GC cultures, not a caucus. I don't know. I don't remember why I left that, whether it's because I really didn't want that, I want to work in that lab, I want to get out of there, or it was this other opportunity, being that now I was connecting with other people and was interested in doing something more, I don't know, probably more meaningful, and also, I need to figure out, I didn't put the years down here, I'm thinking I had notes, but of when I had can't remember. So I'm afraid I'm again failing to really understand if it was friends who were already working for the Bird, which may have been very well what it was. Because this is what I remember. In my time at Emory, was it my first year? Should have been 70 into 71, maybe it was. We had to take basic classes, and I was in experimental psychology, but we had to take basic abnormal psychology. And so I must have already known people from the Bird. Or was I already started, because it was 72 when I started working there. So Miller Francis was one of the queer people who worked for the Bird. And Jane, then Liflander, was another. And I knew her from this community of women that were all coming out and were leftists and had worked together. And him, he was a Bird person. And I remember asking him, maybe it was 72, because I'm thinking 71 would have been, how did I know about the Bird if I wasn't working there? Well, I did know about it, but I didn't know the people who worked there very well. In any case, I asked him to come to, I asked my instructor, what about if I brought in homosexual to our abnormal psychology class? And because that was considered one of the abnormal psychology, that was one of the things you studied, homosexuality. So I said, I bring in a liberation person. And the instructor was, yeah, that's great, we do it. So Miller Francis came into the class. And that's what I remember about that year at Emory was that, and was I out yet? I probably wasn't out myself. Or if I was, I wasn't saying that, but I was going to bring in this homosexual guy. And so they weren't all going to come ask him, what caused this? And what, they were going to. And he basically gave a lecture on Kate Millett and sexual politics. It was great. Anyway, so that was how Emory was going out. And I changed to clinical the second year because I figured, I can't do this, studying in the sleep lab. And I was really interested in this stuff, but I felt more and more connected to social justice activism and didn't want to be in an ivory tower and have to spend all my time being a student. So I figured clinical was better because then you learn how to help people in the community with their psychological and emotional stuff, and that would be at least connect me more to, well, that didn't last either, but anyway, the head of the Emory clinical department at that time was a lesbian. Now, she wasn't out, but people knew because we were all coming out and everything. We kind of knew who she was. And I said, yeah, it's great, I'll be. And then one of the things that stopped me, I think, it gave me a pause, which is when you're doing this, believe it or not, you're in this second year of your graduate study and you're going to be able to see students who come into a clinic and you're going to be able to see them and be a therapist with them, like testing you out on them, poor kids. So when I started doing that, so I'm not, it's like you can't be personal with people. You can't let them know anything about yourself. And certainly you're not going to want to be out. People still weren't. That wasn't a safe thing or good thing to do. But this young man came in, undergraduate came in, who was having gay panic, as they call it, homosexual panic. And someone else had done an intake interview on it, and I was reading it, I said, homosexual panic, it just sounds kind of extreme, like, what are you talking about? That he was, he was afraid that maybe he was, he was having these thoughts. So, okay, so now I'm going to see him. And so I'm doing basic, questions about who he is and his life and stuff. And I get to, and I guess when you first talk to somebody, it talked about how you may have some fears about homosexuality. And this kid, all of a sudden, couldn't talk. I mean, he didn't have his voice anymore. It was like, and it was like, oh. It was like a very classical, there's a name for it, when all of a sudden an emotional thing happens and the person loses their voice. it's actually a known psychological, thing. And it was like, I was seeing Ryan Fontana, and it was all about him being queer, or thinking he might be queer, and being so afraid and upset about it. And I couldn't help him by telling him, hey, I'm a lesbian, I see nothing wrong with that, but I couldn't do that. And when I went after to talk about it with whoever was, I don't know if it was Bonnie herself or somebody else, it was like, no, you can't. It was like they would not let me be someone who could really help a person by saying, I know there's nothing wrong with being homosexual, because I am, and it was like, wow, I don't think I could do this.
Because how did they want to approach it?
Just have the person keep talking and help them. Not that you wouldn't say, there's nothing wrong with you. Not that, well, you're not supposed to be that directive, but so in order to let the person express their stuff and get them to what's happening and really get them to look at why they might be reacting this way and why do you think that way, and do this kind of stuff that, I think people now in therapy are real different. I think they can really have a different, not only point of view, but it seems like, I don't know if there was a whole change in ethics around, clinical psychology, but back then, like anything personal, it wasn't like just that you were gay, but that was, but it wasn't, it's like telling anything about you, that wasn't what you were supposed to do at all. It was a therapist-patient relationship, and that should not mean they know anything about you, or not about you, it's about that. Now, I understood that, but in this case, that was really important and vital. That's how this person could have been, to me, most help, But anyway, and I realized that I was going to have to be doing a master's thesis at this point, and I would just be spending all my time being a student, and I just couldn't with all this stuff going on that I wanted to, get involved in. So I actually had terrible grades last semester or whatever, because I knew it wasn't going to stay. I just started doing less studying, to what I usually have to do to get good grades.
And what were some of the things that you were spending your time doing instead?
Well, it was all this, social justice stuff around, whether it was still anti-war stuff going on, it was race stuff, it was stuff around women's liberation, it was gay liberation starting, and I was coming out. And I met all these women who were so much into getting power themselves because of having experienced, even with positive and progressive anti-racist or leftist politics, we're still seeing sexism. So wanting to be in a place where we could be getting power from each other and talking with each other about those issues and how to deal with that, not deal with homophobia, but deal with sexism and deal with racism and deal with all these things. But we thought, doing it in a separatist way was the best option at that point.
And were there organizations that you were active in where these discussions were taking place, or was it more informal that you were meeting?
Oh, with the discussions with the women, you mean? Mm-hmm. Well, no, I don't remember being in any organizations. I can't remember if it was, I think it was after Alpha first officially got its name and started actually operating as Alpha that I joined the bird. I think that's true. Because I remember writing about the beginning of Alpha and this new organization forming and all that. But I wasn't in, I was in that food co-op, but I was in something called the Anti-Imperialist Coalition, which I don't even remember exactly what we did in that. But I remember it being an organization. But I wasn't in, like at that point, I wasn't yet in the Bird, I wasn't with WRFG. I was never in the Women's Liberation, Land and Women's Liberation. I knew about it, there were some women in the Bird who obviously were, who had been. So I wasn't like, I was in school, probably is what was happening. I was in school, and it wasn't like, So it was in order to help be and form this organization that's what I wanted to do rather than be a student.
And those discussions begin when?
Well, I'm sure the first Alpha meeting, official meeting was, I think in June of 72, but there probably were discussions among women who were in these early lesbian feminist households, and in some of them who related more than I did. I would go to dances and once in a while to maybe a meeting at the GLF, Gay Liberation Front. But some of them maybe a little more involved. And so they were coming from there, and they were coming from Land and Women's Liberation, and coming from, other places where they had done either anti-war work or civil rights work, or in case of Vicky, like being in SDS and the Weather Underground, and so there were lots of places where people were coming from. And so I guess, and I'm wondering whether the food co-op was one of the things that brought a lot of people together. Maybe it was WRFG too. I remember people who were involved in the early WRFG being part of that lesbian group. I don't remember that.
Yeah, when was RFG founded?
We'd have to look that up, because somewhere around that same time, I'm sure, is when that started. Because it was when Alpha, it was a little before that, because when Alpha formed, like in maybe the second year, Elaine Kolb, who was one of the founding mothers, had the first lesbian show on WRFG, so it was already functioning at that point.
So that would be by 74.
Yeah, 73.
Okay.
She wasn't around a long time, so, at Alpha. So it was probably more like 73. Maybe even the first year. I'd have to look all that stuff up. See, I wish I had written out some dates here, but. So there was discussion, I think, like you say, informally, or, this is what we need to do. There was even discussion with some people who were in Gay Liberation Front who weren't lesbian. Like, there was a woman who was bisexual. She was married, and they were both, like, bisexual. And so the question was, would she be allowed to be an alpha? So with all these, that before it became Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance, and that was for lesbians. And as long as you said you were a lesbian, you wanted to be in a lesbian organization, there's no test or anything. It's just, it's a lesbian organization.
What if the bisexual woman said she was a lesbian, but was still in a relationship with a man?
Well, I think that was a part of all the discussion involved.
Yeah.
And I think most of us probably felt at that point, like many women still do, my age, that a lesbian is a woman-born woman who loves other women, So no, she wouldn't. She's bisexual, and back then that was different to us than being a lesbian. So, yeah. No, it was real clear that she wasn't happy about it, but that she was not going to be, in Alpha when Alpha formed. But on the other hand, there were women who came and hung around events and who joined the softball team, and they weren't always identified as lesbian yet. They did come out eventually, but, so it wasn't like, if you're a straight feminist, don't ever show up at our door. It's like, we didn't, if they were a woman, you want to be, you come to an alpha meeting, you want to come, yeah. It was how would you tell,
Right.
It's just nowadays, what do? Open, let's say if you're transsexual that hasn't had an operation yet, take your pants off? So, was there a card I could pull out and say, see, I'm a lesbian? But if you were willing to say you were a lesbian, be in a lesbian organization, that'd be great, come on. That's okay with us, And of course, it was very few women that I think came who weren't identified as lesbian or didn't think they probably were lesbians, so. So yeah, there was probably early in '72, maybe even, I'm trying to remember when I came out. I always think it's '71 when there was at least I came out publicly. There was a May Day conference in Atlanta, kind of a national thing. And the day before, they made it a women's and a gay conference day, like a special day around. So when you were signing up for this, you would say you were coming which day, and then it would say gay or straight. And so that's when first time I said gay. I think it was the year before Alpha, actually. It could have been earlier in that year. See, I'm very bad about it. Maybe it was, if it was a May Day conference, it was in earlier that year when then Alpha was still in discussion. Interesting how if you didn't write things down, you thought you'd remember stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then you don't. So anyway, it was around that time. About the bird, like I said, everybody knew about the Great Speckled Bird because then you read it because that was the movement newspaper. And I guess I must have heard from, maybe Jane was already working there, maybe one of the other women who did work there also said, oh, you don't have a job right now, why don't you see if the bird needs somebody? I don't remember. I'm assuming it would have been really, easy to say, oh yeah, they're hiring, we're hiring now, or they're hiring now. And I don't remember there being any kind of a hard interview thing. Probably they were looking for people who were social justice activists and who were interested in that, and who had some experience, and that's what you could tell us that they were interested in. So it's just like being in Vista. All of a sudden, I'm in the Bird and I'm learning, how to do a typesetter, how to lay out a newspaper, or how to be a reporter. I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, you didn't have any experience with any of that. Where was their office at that time? Were they on Juniper?
Juniper. When I was there with Juniper, it was after they had been firebombed and had moved from this. So it was in Juniper. Yeah, that's where I was. 72 and 73. Between 72. So it was like about a year I was there, that's all.
And do you recall who you first met? Or who
No,
interviewed you?
I really don't. But I know that Jane was also working there at that time. I don't remember whether she was already working there. Could have been that she was already there. Then I got to meet Miller because he was queer also, and I was getting to know all the LGBT folks around. And I did get into a eating co-op. There were a lot of those around. There still is with the lesbian community, but where you would you'd have a group of people, and one person every night would do the cooking for everybody else, and you came over and you all ate together. So I was in an eating co-op with Nancy. Oh God, she changed her name now.
Was she at the Bird?
Yeah,
Presley?
they were all Bird people.
Nancy Presley?
Yes. She has another name, doesn't she? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just totally, and Dave Gustafson, and there was another guy, I remember him, he was a very thin guy with long hair, I forget his name. They were all in the eating co-op. So I guess there's 4 of us. I'm gonna, Presley Jones.
Nancy Jones, yeah.
Nancy Jones, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. So I got to know, them a little better because of, besides just being at the Bird working a particular day, I would, we were friends otherwise. And I remember off and on different people and names, but it's interesting how, maybe I'm trying to shut it out because it wasn't, I loved the experience of learning different things and doing the reporting and being able to let people know what was happening with Alpha, this new organization, and how they were open to gay liberation and to that happening and that being part of what they're also gonna look at beside women's stuff and class and race stuff. So I thought it was wonderful, but I think it was a very hard, the discussions weren't easy, and they were also, you're working constantly for like very, very little money. So I finally decided, because of what my living situation was, that I needed to bring more money into wherever I was, the situation, so I needed to find like a real job, or, you know, a job that paid more. I guess you'd have to be someone who lived in kind of a communal situation, where you weren't bringing in a lot of money, but you lived with 5 other people, and, you know.
Because where were you living at that point?
I don't remember. I don't remember because one of the things was I was living by myself at that point, and that's why I wanted to get, I hardly ever lived by myself. There were some times I did though. I remember when that I might have been around then, because.
Do you recall where you moved after you left Emory and the group of women you were living with?
The first place after I actually don't. I'm trying to, because I know we lived in Drury, then we lived in St. Louis Place, and that's when where did I live after that? Oh, the Alpha House. Huh. I was living at the first Alpha House. That was, we call it Edge of Night. That was the name of our house, but that was the first Alpha House. That's where I lived first after coming out and not being at Emory anymore. That was on Mansfield, right below 5 Points. But I think when I got into 73, when I got into the Bird, that my house might have been already, because we, I don't know, if people just moved out and we decided we needed to close a move elsewhere, what happened? I don't remember how it broke up. Then we didn't have a house for a while. Alpha didn't. It was like we had a library in one person's house, the mail went somewhere else. And so I might have been at that point, that because it was 73, 72, 73, that I might have like found, there's a little efficiency apartment that I had, a little 5 Points. I was living by myself. So it might have, you know, something like that. There was a reason why it was probably making less money than I made in Vista. And Vista was, you know, they just gave you enough to basically kind of live. So yeah, it was intense. It was like a lot of work, and I think that's when I probably got a job at Southern Bell, or was it Sears? It was one of those, you know, I had a series of like jobs that women usually didn't get.
Yeah, I was reading about that in your other interviews.
But while I was at the Bird, I just remember feeling like it was so interesting because it was such a diverse group of folks. Some people there was really very much like they were, I call it the hippie kind of love everybody and music and drugs. So that's really what their culture and their feeling was, and that's what they wrote about, you know. And then there were the people who were the real leftists and communists and stuff, and they were, you know, about this and that and the other. And then there was a lot of kind of people who weren't either one of those really, but like myself, who were in a particular community organizing kind of place, and maybe WRG was important because that had started up, and maybe they were working with the Black Panthers here, and it was important about, or maybe they were working with the school system, and what was happening there was important. And interestingly enough, the 2 people I talked about who were the gay folks I knew there were other gay people, I'm sure, that worked there. I just can't remember at this point. But Miller and Jane, they both decided they were members of October League? Shit. I think it was the October League. And that they couldn't be gay because you have to be a good communist, you couldn't be a queer.
Mm-hmm.
And like that shocked me. It was like, what the fuck? He was one of the women that started Alpha and a gay liberation front guy deciding this. It was a very interesting time. But I love being part of that, but obviously I couldn't live with the money and the amount of work it took. If it had been less work in that money, or a little more money in that work, it might have been, but I guess my commitment wasn't as great to that as it was to like Alpha and other stuff that, was.
Well, it's very interesting that you come into the Bird in '72 at the same time that Alpha is just getting off the ground.
Yeah.
And that you're just coming out into this whole new world and forging your way.
I think probably it was because, since it was, whatever I heard, there was an opening or try for this, it was like, because that was a place to get the information out. This is a place that was willing to, there wasn't a lot of places. Atlanta Journal-Constitution wouldn't even print the word gay or lesbian or anything, so maybe it was partly, oh yeah, let's, we're going to be here and we're going to get our voice out. We're going to let people know this is happening.
So can you talk about the sort of day-to-day work that you did, as you recall it?
What I remember is basically a lot of it is production. When we were there at the place, I mean, I wouldn't be sitting there writing stuff. I don't think people were writing somewhere else when it was probably less hectic. And being there was either meetings when decisions were being made about what was going to be in the issue of this good or was that bad, or what could be concentrated on, that kind of stuff. And production, putting the newspaper together. And I was involved in learning how to do the laying out. And this is all like, no computers at that point. This is like printing out, columns of paper, trying to fit them onto pages, and where would it go in the next page, and where would you put the graphic. And so it was learning, to do, and doing that whole process. And that took a while. It was always like deadline, like we're going to make it this week, or we're going to get it together.
Do you remember who you worked with or who taught you?
I really don't. I am so sorry. I probably could look at like a bird at that time and say, oh yeah, that name and this name.
Mm-hmm.
But that's out, except the people I already mentioned. I mean, that would certainly be there too. But yeah, it's crazy that I don't remember. I'm not even. I remember people who I think, did they work for the Bird, or do I just know them from like Teddy Lane? Did she work for the Bird, or did I just get to know her through leftist organizations or something? Do you know? Have you? She might not be a Bird person.
Is she the same person as Teddy Vale?
Oh, Vale, but her name is now Vale.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Teddy was involved.
Okay. See, I'm not even sure who
Right.
who worked the Bird, who was yeah. And there were women in the women's, and Stephanie Coffin, of course she was still there, but there were other women who, maybe Kristen was there, because Nancy was there, and Jane was there, and Cactus sometimes. I mean, I don't know how long she actually worked with them, whether she just reported on stuff. Her name is Pam Norris, but she was known as Cactus. Also an Alpha person, Native American woman. And yeah.
Well, and that's also, as it's been explained to me, the way the Bird, as intense as it was and as structured to have meetings and deadlines and schedules, it was very porous of, if you want to come learn how to do something,
Mm-hmm.
if you want to come to the discussion, to lay out, if you want to pick up some papers to sell this week, so
Yes,
things
no,
rotated,
in fact,
people
it was a
came-
very conscious thing that everybody would eventually work in each department or area and learn all the stuff. I mean, I remember that being a very part of the, the way they were set up in the culture. So, yeah.
So you did layout at some point, or periodically, regularly.
And you know, when I, this sounds silly, I know, but when I then went on to get other jobs and I looked at my resume, what did I put on? I put local news editor and reporter. So did I do editing? I must have at some point, but I'm not remembering that very much.
And local news reporting.
Local news, yeah. Which is kind of broad, but.
Which was an area of focus, and various people sort of had that role. I don't know if you ever overlapped at all with Krista Brewer.
Krista, that's what I was thinking of before. Not Kristen, but Krista.
Yeah, Krista did local, and there was a man that Krista worked closely with and identifies as sort of her mentor. And I'm drawing a blank on his name.
And you know, it's all much too vague. I don't have really clear memories. There must have been people who were like mentors, who were people that really helped with how to do X, Y, Z, and what that means, and what was important about a story, you know, and certainly had to edit, you know, but I don't have those clear memories at all.
But you did do writing. We can document that
Yeah.
by going back and looking in the paper. Do
Yeah.
you recall anything that you
No,
wrote?
I'd have to look myself. And since, because at one point I was looking a little bit, going back, and, you know, it's online now, all the bird. So I was looking, I was going, oh, I don't remember doing that, you know, it was like, a lot of it, I'm sure, was about Alpha, or about, you know, that connection with gay liberation and queer stuff that was happening. Because that was what I knew.
I'll bring up, I know, for instance, that you did write one article in the fall of '72, where I think it was a series, that you and other members of Atlanta's gay and lesbian community, folks from Gay Liberation Front and people outside of that organization, went to a conference in Athens.
Ah,
There was
I think it was the first gay and lesbian conference, Southeastern
it was
Gay Conference, probably it was called.
It was like calling on all gay militants, I think is. And you attended that conference.
Oh, yeah.
and then reported about it.
Yeah.
In the Bird.
I have pictures of that still. And yeah, so I remember the pictures I have make me remember Cactus again. Jane and Cactus went with filming and took pictures and recordings and stuff. Yeah, that was like the first one. It's funny because sometimes now people who came into the LGBT and queer, you know, movement at various points, they'll think like, oh yeah, I remember that Southeastern Gay Conference I went to. That was the first one. I go, no. It was one way back, and they wouldn't even know about it. It was like at one point they were doing like trying to do a queer history and saying, and this is the first Dyke March. And I said, no, Alpha did one way back, and you know. So sometimes, because of this disconnect between people that were there then and now, there's an incomplete, and I wish I had a better memory, because then I would probably even have more things to say, oh, no, you're forgetting this and that and the other, but I'd have to look at Birds or, you know, the Alpha newsletter to remember, you know, this is what actually happened. I'm glad we have those. I'm glad we have both the Bird and the newsletters. Boy, that gives you a lot of good history. You know?
No, it's fantastic. Really, really amazing resources. The person that Krista worked with, John Jacobs.
Ah.
I don't know if you ever worked with.
I know I must have worked with him, but I don't remember him.
Or Burl Boykin? Did you work with Burl at all?
Well, I know Burl, I don't remember knowing him real well. That's interesting, because I got to know him much better in the last couple of years of his life. And Dave Haywood always wanted me to, like, because he'd have stories about Burl, and I go, I don't have stories because I don't remember. I know he did a lot of the cultural, writing and reviews and film and was a writer himself, but yeah, I don't remember much more than, I'm sure he was someone that worked at that time also. It's funny how, because my focus must have really, the memories are based around some kind of particular interest and focus that I had. Seems like other things just like, oh yeah, they must have been there, but what the hell were they doing? I don't remember it or. Well, can we take a break?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're just coming back from a break, and talked a little bit during the break that we'll continue our conversation about your work and experience around the great speckled bird, and then we'll break for the day and come back and wrap up the interview in a second session. So here I'll ask, what was your general impression of the paper, and what it was as a type of media, and how it was received, and that's broadly construed by many different types of people?
I think the paper was seen in many different ways by many different people. The people that understood the politics of the people that wrote were probably afraid of the bird, because it's like what alternative media exists now. It's going to print some truths that a lot of local media or the usual kind of coverage is not going to show you. It's going to have more analysis of what's happening than just reporting what's happening. And I think those who read the paper and who had that kind of intersectional, as we were saying, political analysis, really saw it as like, wow, this is important, this is vital. These are people doing like investigative type reporting, or reporting on issues that you're not going to hear being emphasized anywhere else. And then on the other hand, there were people who saw the bird as this countercultural newspaper, just, all the right music and all the right information about drugs and all the right information about communes and how to live together, and because there were people writing about that stuff also and all the time. That's a whole different, so that was what people call the hippie kind of culture, and it fit in with that, not only because you had people on the bird who liked that cultural stuff and wanted to write about it and present it and remind people this was happening, but also visually the paper became something that, oh, it's kind of like weird, it's this wonderful looking, artistic and creative and weird, wild kind of paper, and I can go out and sell it on the strip, where all the people like me are. And sometimes, we don't call them homeless back then, but people that were on the street people, and people that, didn't have a job but needed to make a little money to get some food. So grab some papers and let's go sell them. And it was a little risky too, because you could get arrested. People, the wrong cop came along and you were doing the wrong, And so it was seen in like all different ways, I think. And it had different aspects to it. So although I came from a particular point of view, there were others who started it who were very, coming from the educational and historical, perspective, and not only were leftists, but had that. And then there were people coming from the celebratory, love everyone, and let's listen to music and smoke some kind of place. And how could they be in the same newspaper? But they were. So how it was seen, when I saw it, I saw, of course, the stuff around the importance of the intersections between racism, sexism, homophobia, war and imperialism, all that stuff. It kind of fit together to me. It wasn't separate. It all made, and they, as Berg was talking about all of that, and looking and writing about all of that, and open to discussion around all of it. So wow, this is what a great tool. And also, and of course, there was a Liberation News Service, so we got a lot of world and national stuff that connected everybody and all over the country and other places with what was going on. So it was very, not just local, it was national, it was sometimes international, all in one place. I mean, my God, no wonder they spent so much time putting that together. It was a lot of information to try to get in there. So I'm sure when I saw it, I thought, oh, this is wonderful, I mean, first of all, I liked it visually, the layout was just very interesting. Wasn't like reading an old newspaper with just a lot of columns and black and white. So it was like, and that's what attracted people and made it sellable too, I think, even people that came in who were tourists who wanted to see the hippies. And, oh, I gotta see that, so I'll buy that, and that's how people made money, is people were just interested in that. Boy, they never got another one, they never subscribed to it or anything, but, so, yeah. Like I said, I don't know how many times I did it. I can't really remember having a great experience, probably not knowing how to sell it very well and not making a lot of money, but trying to, when I was not working at all, just trying to make some money selling it. You have to have the right spot, and you have to know the right way of who to approach and who not to, and all that stuff. A whole interesting kind of cultural thing was being a person who sold a bird and what that was about and how that worked. Interesting.
Do you remember where you would try to sell it?
Yeah, I'm on a strip. What I'm saying, the strip, it's nothing, I mean, you wouldn't even know it anymore, nothing like it. Like Colony Square is now, and then all that way on Peachtree, all the way down 10th Street, maybe a little beyond that. So all this area of Midtown on Peachtree, and then some of the side streets had clubs or, bars and gathering places. And that was known as the Strip, and it wasn't any big high-rises over there at that point. Colony Square didn't exist. That was the first thing, I think, that started changing the whole area. We used to Alpha have benefits at places up there, on the Strip. I can't remember, I'd have to look at the newsletters to remember the names of the places. But clubs and bars that would let community organizations, hold fundraisers and events and stuff. So that was a pretty common place for us to go to have stuff like that. Until Little Five Points itself started developing, and then got a pub, and then had more places to, Little Five Points to actually have events like that.
Mm. How much overlap was there between Alpha or Alpha people and the bird, as you recall it? And not only in terms of of people actually working or participating in the bird, but just interest and like, did Alpha and the gay and lesbian community that you were part of, was the bird important to them, do you think?
My analysis was the early women who formed an Alpha and were part of what built up the organization at first would have been much more interested and connected to the bird than a lot of the people that joined as it became bigger and bigger and were more interested in being with lesbians and lesbian feminists and didn't have that much of that connection to any history of class struggle or struggle about racism or anything like that. So I don't think there were, talking about the larger Alpha and as it grew, there probably was a minimal interest. That's my feeling anyway. I don't think there was, just a handful of us who ever worked with the bird or, who maybe even read it, really.
Yeah, I know I was asking in part, thinking about that, as I told you, I've been doing some research in the Alpha papers, and I know that one of the amazing things that Alpha members did was news clippings about issues related to gay and lesbian life, and particularly in Atlanta, and there are clippings from the Great Speckled Bird. So I know that somebody, possibly you, was clipping those and saving them, but also, like Alpha did in the newsletter, the Great Speckled Bird on the back page had a calendar of events, as well as a sort of resource list of organizations and phone numbers. And the Alpha and Gay Liberation Front, when it existed, were included there, where Alpha events would be listed in the calendar. And I was just curious how much.
Yeah, I mean, it might be, people have had different views of it. I feel like kind of a lot of things were put in because they had to be, because it was gay liberation happening and it was a women's movement happening. So we kind of like said, you need to have us in there. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't think many of the straight friends who started, would have seen that as a very vital part of the bird if it hadn't been for what was happening and the movements that, were pushing it. And also they were intersectional in their analysis. I mean, the early liberation and the early Alpha were very much that. And that probably changed with the gay movement and with the lesbian stuff later on. Became more focused and, I don't know. But it was a very different feeling back then. And now it's getting back to that feeling of intersectionality with the organizations that exist now. It's almost like I feel much more comfortable with an organization like Song than I would with Georgia Equality. That's me, though. That's because
Right.
I am in my background.
And things then, just the media landscape was very different and limited, like for Alpha to, or for any gay and lesbian interest group, or any sort of progressive interest group, to get word out.
Yeah.
Alpha had their newsletter, which was great, but it went to that subset of people, and if you wanted to have...
Oh, but it went all over the country too, just like we got other...
Right, with the bird, with exchanges. And, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
But if you were looking to broadcast a message,
Yeah. WRG was the only, other media. Yeah. Yeah, now you don't have to worry, it's on the internet. You have your own, you develop your own network and system and, get to whoever you want. It's amazing. Amazing that more, I just think more can be done now than ever before. So why isn't there more happening now than ever before? I don't know. And I'm sorry I can't give you more details about the bird. It's really interesting that it's very, I don't know, seems all very vague to me at times. I remember more about cutting myself one time than about, like, who taught me about news editing. We would have to reuse the X-Actos and we'd be cutting everything. And I still have the scar here. This scar is, I just missed that vein. It was like this deep cut.
Oh,
I was
wow.
bleeding, but it was like if I had gone over just a quarter of an inch, I would have been like gushing. I remember that, but weird.
No, memory works that way, and you are certainly not alone. Myself included, as well as the many other people that I've interviewed. Some things you remember, and a lot of things you don't. There's nothing you can do about it. Can you talk a bit about relationships among the bird people and as you perceived it while you were there?
Don't have good memories of that either, because I just know there were some people who were in couples, but most people weren't. Probably much like an alpha community over years, there were people who had relationships with different people. That's happened in we call it fruit basket turnover in alpha. I don't know what they call it, a great speckled bird. But, and I didn't have real close friendships outside of the bird with most of the bird people. Alpha was my community, except for the eating co-op people. And other than that, yeah. So I didn't have an inside scoop into their relationships. If they worked well, if they were affected by working at the bird, there were some people who didn't seem to have any partners or girlfriend-boyfriend connections, seemed very alone. And like I said, then there were people who were together. But I don't remember any sense of that said anything specific to me about how the bird operated, and maybe it did affect how it operated, but I'm out of the loop on it if it did.
You mentioned that you didn't have an inside scoop, sort of playing on the idea of inside outside. Do you feel that that there was a tight friendship cohesion? You said Alpha was your group, not the bird. Did you feel that the bird, that a lot of the other people that were involved with the bird, that was their group, that there was a sort of that was its own community?
I'd just be guessing. I would assume that, and especially the people who had been around at the beginning and gone through the firebombing and all that something like that kind of tends to bring you together, you being targeted. And so I would think maybe that was probably true. I would think of some of the other people. And that some people went to school together originally, so they were all friends already, and maybe they didn't live far from each other. So there's ways that you then have friendship networks that are not based just on work, but and that happened more with those people and not with me, except for those few people that were queer people. Yeah, so I have I'm afraid I have little sense of that, and I don't even know, I wouldn't even be able to tell you, so-and-so was with so-and-so, and then they were with so, I have no, I can't even do that with Alpha. People will talk to me about it, or will say something about, oh, you know, it's when I was living with so-and-so, and we would get, I say, you were? Some things flew over my head. I didn't have a good connection with who is with who and relationships.
Mm. What about the working relationships at the Bird?
Like I said, I just remember that being a very communal kind of workplace. And people, as long as you were willing to learn what you needed to or do what you needed to, then, you know, you could really be involved in any number of things and really learn all the different aspects. Excuse me. And that was part of that whole feeling of whether it's communism, socialism, or communalism, the whole idea of people equally sharing and bringing what they have to what's available, and teaching each other and learning and not feeling possessive about something. And not saying, you can't do it, only I can. That kind of stuff was all very, you know, it's like Alpha too, rejection of hierarchy, having a president and then this and that and the other. We just said, you know. In fact, it got, I mean, the Alpha, it really made a mess sometimes of, I mean, it was like, so who's responsible for X, Y, Z? Or, and to try to explain to a new person, they'd say, okay, who do I talk to about so-and-so? Well, what do you want to know? You can talk to me. What do you want? I don't talk to you about how to get on the newsletter committee. Oh, I just come to the meeting next time. And no names, you know. Well, that was a dual, because, I mean, I always thought, I want to have my damn name, and I'm an out lesbian. I want to have my name, but it was the only thing about you put the first name and the last initial only. Because some people really didn't want to be out, and they were afraid, you know. But that lasted throughout the whole time. I'm going, are we really still doing this? Why? What is that about? I guess I was very privileged. I never had to worry about kids and what would happen to kids. And I wasn't married, so I didn't have to worry about my spouse and what would happen if, you know, so it was like, yeah, we should be more proud of who we are. Put our name in it, put our address in it. So I guess in the Bird, knowing that they were also targeted, and they could be targeted by some right-wing nuts that would come by again to do damage or whatever, there was probably that kind of connection and camaraderie, is that we're all in this together, you know. But yeah, I don't say I have much recollection of how the relationships played out at the Bird itself.
What about the sort of the atmosphere and process of the sort of editorial meetings, the layout meeting, where decisions are having to be made?
Yeah, I think, like I said, it seems to be all blocked. And I don't know if that's because I just wasn't there very much, you know, in terms of, or if it was so bad that I would just rather forget about how they were. I'm really not sure about that, to be honest. I mean, I know there was a lot of discussion, and there might have been some tension because of differences of opinion. But I'm not, you know, emotionally I'm not, nothing's coming up about how, oh, they were so much fun, or, oh man, they were so dry. I just don't have that.
No, I think that's telling.
Mm. Hmm.
And you've mentioned working with Miller and Jane specifically, who both were also queer on the paper. And you came certainly from a feminist orientation. What are your thoughts on the ways that gender, sexuality, race, class, these sort of intersectional issues, how that played out at the Bird, both in terms of coverage as well as in terms of staffing, interpersonal relations, priorities?
I think I got there too late to have felt what some of the women might have that finally formed the Women's Caucus and that kind of thing, because there obviously were some feelings around the sexism that they were experiencing. And I don't remember that being an issue. There were already women doing all kinds of jobs and some queer folks there and that were very open to. So I think if there was a lot of stress or tension or disagreement or fights or anything like that, I missed it. I missed that. I wasn't there early enough for. That's my feeling about it. It's interesting.
But you were aware that prior to your coming there, that there had
Yeah,
been.
well, I think even in some of the stuff in the paper when you read about, it was writing about, what was going on. So yeah. Just like in every other, like I said, the women that formed AFLU came from, whether it was in Gay Liberation Front, whether it was in a left organization, a student organization, civil rights or type organization, feeling like there was always that male leadership who was emphasized, and the kind of sexism that still was ingrained in many men, even as much as they wanted to be liberal and intersectional. And so, I mean, of course that would happen with the Bird people too. I mean, it's not like they're any different than anybody. They're still born in the society and grew up and were educated in that way. But like I really don't remember when I was there having I've been making stuff up. I'm thinking, was there something around, there was some people who I felt were anti-gay. And it wasn't anti-gay, it was more like, well, it was anti-gay in a way. It's just not the important issue. Why are we even dealing with this? Okay, so you're gay, who cares, but we're dealing with real issues here. Why are we dealing with this shit? So there was some, I'm sure, people who kind of felt like that. But on the other hand, they were overruled because we had ability to put all this information out and information in the newspaper and cover events and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, even queers themselves, like I said, who ended up feeling like that, like, oh, I can't put all this energy into being queer. That's that's not what a good communist does. So, so there's some of that, I'm sure, among other staff people.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't remember any personal, experiences of. The straight people that I knew were very, very open, gay friendly, you'd say, but not even as like, you're just another person, you're my friend, it doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is. So. Good people.
And in your time there and doing the work that you were doing, was there some sort of guiding personal objective that you had, of what you hope to be contributing to for the paper to be, or?
I don't remember anything like that. No, I don't think so. It was what it was. It wasn't like something that I thought it should not be, that it was doing. I don't remember feeling like that at all. It was just like glad I got to do something, experience that for a while. I don't have any sense that I had some kind of goal or overriding reason to do what I was doing.
Mhm. And after you left the paper, did you look back and sort of think to yourself, or identify to yourself, that there were certain skills that you had learned, developed during that time working there?
I'm sure I learned something about writing, reporting kind of thing, which maybe helped with writing some stuff for the Alpha newsletter, and certainly laying out and all that. Learned a lot about that whole production thing and never knew about almost any of that, so that was interesting. And I'm sure it had helped me, must help me with the Alpha newsletter. I mean, the same thing with the Alpha newsletter. We were mimeographing, and then eventually, I don't even remember when there's such things as copy machines and Xerox, and we went to, I don't know. So I'm sure it helped. I'm sure it helped in a lot of ways. It's always good to know more, have more different skills, even if you didn't use them a whole lot. They're going to be useful somehow. So yeah, I don't have to look back even. I just knew that was, was really helpful to me to have had those experiences and learning something.
Mm-hmm. And how would you describe the whole time that you were there? It was the Juniper Street location. How would you describe the sort of physical environment of that office space? What was it like?
Well, I remember it as a very hectic, thrown together. Obviously, I'm not a very good housekeeper myself, so I didn't even think of, like, how could I help get everything more organized? Things were organized enough where you knew how to get what you needed, but I remember it as being a very, I don't know, like if you were a middle class or professional kind of person and you came to the Alpha House, you'd be distraught, like, oh my God. And if you came to the Bird, I think you'd feel the same way, as if it was a place of business, And it was fine with me. It didn't seem, I was comfortable with that, I don't know how else to put it. So it was very kind of structured disorganization.
And it was in an old house, the building itself.
Yeah.
Is
And Midtown was, it's like a little Five Points area, the Emmons Park and Candler Park and all that was at that point, they were very cheap places to live. They were old houses that sometimes were abandoned by people who lived there, and they were landlords now. And so it was this old house that, that's what I remember anyway. It seemed like, to me, it was very comfortable, but some people might not find it comfortable at all.
And it was all just workspace. There was nobody living at the house.
I don't remember, and I'm not going to say I know for sure, but I don't think people were living there. think so.
The spaces that you recall there, though, were layout tables and desks and filing
Yeah.
cabinets, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
And as a local news editor, and you had said earlier that the pay wasn't very much. What do you recollect the pay to be?
I mean, everybody got the same amount, whatever it was. I don't know. I keep on thinking in my head $50 a week, but I don't know if that was real. I think it was that.
Right. And with that, you recall working long hours.
Yeah. Well, as long as you had to, you know. I mean, there probably was a set, like, minimum number of hours, but it's like anything with that kind of a situation. You just, you have to get this thing done, so you just do it, you know. It's like owning your own business. That's what it was, right? So you just work the hours you need to.
And were those hours, earlier you had mentioned that you thought that when you were doing some writing, like writing an article or something, that likely was not taking place in the office itself.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I really don't remember that kind of, like, where did I write? I don't remember, I really don't. I'm just assuming that was true because there were people there a lot, right, doing all kinds of stuff, and I'm thinking now, I wouldn't be able to sit right in the middle of that and try to do something, but maybe it wasn't like that for me then. It's very possible, like, I was okay with that, I don't remember.
Did it feel, though, in your memory, does it feel like you spent a lot of time, a lot of hours during the week?
Yeah, and it depended on the day too, because it all was around, of course, getting the stuff and having it then put together. So there were very intense days versus not, because then you were out either looking at going to stuff or maybe trying to write something, or it just not, you know, just didn't seem as intense at all.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I remembered more.
And you were, I know that you had a hiatus away from Atlanta when you went to law school out in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
But you were back living, at least in Georgia, if not Atlanta, in the mid-1980s?
Oh, yeah. I came back in '79.
Mm-hmm.
And the only time I was out of Atlanta, other than that, was when I went and did that temporary job at Georgia Legal Services in Savannah.
Mm.
And that was like a year. So from 80 until, well, actually I moved out of Atlanta in like, it was 89 and 90, we moved to Douglas County. So I wasn't in Atlanta, but I was still in Georgia.
Yeah. So were you aware in 1984, 85 of the reincarnated effort? Yeah, I was aware, and I was very interested in getting, reading it when it came out, and I was kind of sad when it just didn't last, Mm-hmm.
I wasn't though in a place where I wanted to contribute to anything or,
Mm-hmm.
Help it, so. Yeah, I remember that. And I was thinking, it'd be great, But, it was a totally different time, so it would have been interesting to see. It didn't, obviously, it didn't grab onto enough people's interest to make it, worth doing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know people who were involved in that, the revival? Did you interview them?
Yeah, there are
Okay.
a handful of people that got back involved.
Mm.
So if this question resonates, how did the work and time that you spent at the Bird affect your life, work, sense of activism, priorities in the years following working there?
It was a very prime example of an alternative way of running a business, you know, cooperative. So I guess right away wanted to get to be a member of Bond Credit Union and also Sevenanda. Might have been inspired by liking the idea of cooperative businesses and organizations. And it was an experience of that whole idea of trying to learn everything and sharing what you knew. And New Leaf was like that. When I joined it, it was pretty early. And it was still where everybody would kind of like be able to learn everything if they wanted to also. So I had a resume, I put anything and everything is what I did there, you know. And that was until the end when I was getting more focused. That was true. You work in the warehouse, you work in the finances, you work in the buying, you work in the phone. So it was like, you know. And that was, I guess maybe I knew that I would like it because I knew what the bird was like, so I don't know. I never really thought of that. I never thought, oh, the bird taught me this, so I'll, you know, you're asking me now, I'm thinking, okay, maybe that's true. But it's not like I said, well, because I went to the Great Speckled Bird and I love that, I think I'll go work at New Leaf. It's not like that. That's not what I did.
And have you maintained relationships with anybody from the bird over the years?
No, except incidentally, like Thomas Stephanie Coffiner and Sevenanda, they were real involved. One time there was a whole time when there was a real big controversy going on in Sevenanda, and they were very involved in that, so I'd see them a lot because we'd go to meetings. I see them at other social justice events. That's kind of how I relate to most of those people. Is I see them at something because we're still in that broader community of people that will do Moral Monday stuff. We'd see them at Moral Monday stuff when that was happening. Nancy Jones, I always felt real close to her, but she's not lived here for a long time, so now we're back relating on Facebook when we get to. So that's the kind of connection, but not very any close connection. And even, like I said, the two queer people that I knew, they weren't queer anymore, they've been not queer a long time, and Cactus, for instance, and other people that related to the bird, Vicky and other people who wrote sometimes for them, and they're dead now, most of them are dead. So I don't have any, lasting friendships, basically,
right,
in that sense.
Have you participated in the reunions? There was a big 40th anniversary.
I went a couple, yeah, I went to.
And then the 50th this past June.
A couple of the reunion, 2 or 3 of the reunion things. But not as someone who put a lot of energy or effort into it, unfortunately, just, I'll show up. So that's, and it's always great because you can see all these people go, whoa,
Yeah.
But it's more like a reunion thing, and I'm not. I got the Great Speckled Bird email group thing, and I'll read it sometimes, but a lot of times I won't even read it, so.
Yeah. And lastly for the day, I promise, from the standpoint now, 51 years since the bird started tomorrow, how do you reflect back and feel about that era of the bird, which is a broader question which we can take up in the next setting as well, if you'd like.
Well, I see it as one of the examples of what the 60s and early 70s is about, which is the possibility that this country was going to be totally brought forward and changed because of all the activism around the issues that still meant that we were not an equal society, when we didn't have equity. And that's what the Bird was about, that's what a lot of the other movements were about. And they all were coming together and all building, and there was that feeling of connection. And the Bird was part of it, was a prime example of that. So it's like a wonderful example, and good thing for people now, young people who are becoming activists, to study, I think, to look at and read and see how the connections were made and seen back then. Not a new thing, you know. Yeah, so I see it as really important, and I think it also is known pretty much all over the country as really one of the better newspapers, underground newspapers, because of a lot of things, you know. So I see it as real important for Atlanta. And I think it also reflects, you know, it dying eventually and not being able to be brought back, reflects the big changes in Atlanta. And it's like, there used to be a sense that, I think, when it was a smaller place and therefore maybe the same number of activists, but it seemed like there were more of us because it was such a smaller population, that it was a more, you could find a lot more activism here. I don't just mean civil rights movement, I mean in general, other stuff. But now, it seems like one of the least, I mean, so many people here come here for various reasons, and yet we don't have the kind of activism that are in a lot of other big cities. It's kind of sad. So I'm not sure. Things kind of died away for some reason, and Atlanta became more of a business and maybe cultural hub, but not a hub of political activism. And so I'm not sure why, but yeah, it's always been just a small percentage of people, and that's how it was then, you know. But we were part of this connection. I think Atlanta, it gets more disconnected from the national stuff than it had in the past. I'm not sure why, what happened. It's like Black Lives Matter, Alliance for Black Lives, all that stuff. There were things that happened here to some people. That should have been national news. Amazing, horrible police murders. And it never got national attention. We know about things happening all over the country, but they don't know about Anthony Hill. And that's how it is now. And I'm going, this is so weird. Why is that? I don't know. Maybe because it just became too much of a business hub in a lot of ways, and that's where all the energy goes into. I don't know. But it's, you know, it's a good reminder of the analysis that did exist, and how there are people now, again, who are in that same place of intersectional analysis, of connections between the movements, and the importance of that. So it's part of a good history that's now coming around again, being seen in different ways in different kinds of organizations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much for coming and spending this time with us, for relating all of these memories, and for agreeing to come back and talk with me a little more about Alpha and some of your other
I always like to
activism.
talk about Alpha.